What's up, buddy? You ready to record this thing?
I can't do this thing, man. My mouth is just too dry. This episode, nay, the entire podcast are in danger, Adam.
Okay. First off, you're being a touch dramatic. Second, we're literally sponsored by Flint's mouth-watering mints. The mint's specially designed to fight that dry mouth you got going on.
Okay, I'm listening.
How dry are you right now?
Drier than panties at Comic-Con, man.
You know, Flint's revolutionary F-strength effect helps you control just how wet that mouth will get. For a situation of stubborn cotton mouth, 250 F-strength, the lemon flavor will provide you a pleasant pucker while splashing your lips with a sizable amount of saliva.
Ooh, okay. Well, what if I'm just a little dry?
A 100 strength mint like their cool watermelon will satiate your taste buds while delivering a refreshingly wet mouth.
Oh my god, my mouth is so moist.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about you saying that, but hey, if it means the show can go on.
Okay, so not only has Flint's Mint saved this episode, and quite possibly the entire podcast, but to show their continued love for our listeners, they're extending the 15% off promo code when you use it on their website, flints.com. It is historically higher. They weren't satisfied with just getting you high. They want to get you historically higher.
Go to www.flints.com and use the promo code historically higher. That's historically higher for 15% off.
Now, whether you're rolling a fatty on a nature hike or preparing to melt into the couch for a movie night, Flint's will conquer the cottonmouth coming your way. You shouldn't be thinking about mints unless you're thinking about Flint's. Ooh, Battle of the Bulge.
80th anniversary?
80th anniversary. This is coming out a couple days after the start of the battle was December 16th, 1944. I know we're a couple days late, but better late than never. It's just the way our scheduling worked out. Not to be confused with the annual 4th of July contest at the gay bar in town.
Battle of the Bulge?
Yeah.
There's a D in that one, right?
I think so.
There's a D in the man package version of Bulge?
Mm-hmm.
Is that why when I was Googling it, it kept...
No, you just kept Googling Bulge. You weren't putting Battle of, I think, in front of it.
Well, the pictures were good either way.
Oh, we get into a nice, comfy spot for me. I'm wearing a new cardigan. I'm feeling smart about this one. But we get to talk today about what's probably the most well-known battle in United States history as far as war goes. And that can be kind of confusing because World War II, you have the Allies, the combination of, everyone, the Canadians, the British, the French that were still fighting with us, everyone. But this is kind of a unique situation where this almost exclusively involves the United States, United States troops. At the very end of it, it ends up, being a matter of just get anyone in there that can fight. But this is kind of what's known as America's greatest moment during World War II.
Yeah, we weren't there during the Blitz. We weren't on the Eastern Front. We were in North Africa, and we were working our way up through there, but that was almost more of like a volley of skirmishes, whereas in the European theater, we put our foot down when we crossed in the D-Day landings. Mm-hmm. And then our first step wasn't necessarily the Battle of the Bulge because we had the liberation of Paris and all that kind of stuff. But our first stomp was almost trying to finish Hitler off in what was his last major offensive.
Yeah, I think they were predicting be home by Christmas. And this is what's going to actually occur during that time period where they predicted that we'd be marching into Berlin.
Well, home by Christmas kind of bit them right in the penis too. Because they start winding down manufacturing. They, I believe at one point, stopped sending out the winter kits for clothing. Mm-hmm. And that becomes a very big issue because the Ardennes forest is very cold and very snowy and just probably not super habitable.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, before we get into it, rate, review, 5 stars whenever you're asked about it. Got anything before we get into it?
No, he's Chris. I'm Adam. I don't know if we did that. If we did, it's always good to have a refresher.
All right, welcome to the Bulge. All right. So a little bit of context to kind of set the stage. Kind of where World War II sits at this point is this is really kind of the tail end. As far as the entire scope of the war, if you factor it beginning 38, 39, this is late 1944. Essentially, the Allies have had, well, if you don't count the Russians, sorry, but the British and Americans really haven't.
You always got to forget that. It's so weird to say that.
It's so weird to say that because you always hear that it was kind of Germany against Russia and then kind of against the Allies in the West.
Well, you say ally, and then like 5 years after the war, it's a combatant. It's enemy.
Less. As soon as Berlin was divided and everything, and it started doing that shit.
Yeah, I guess we got that. I was thinking more like Korea, but yeah.
So up to this point, it's kind of been just the Red Army going at it in the East, and then also like the North Africa campaign for the Allies. But we end up setting foot on the Normandy beaches June 6, 1944. And during the 6-month kind of lead up to the Battle of the Bulge, what's also known as the Ardennes Offensive.
And Operation Autumn Mist.
From the German side, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how Hitler was so sweet with his words to come up with autumn mist. I'm sure the mist was probably maybe blood.
I'm sure someone brought him a list of suggestions. He just got to choose what the coolest one was.
He was probably trying to paint something. That's what it was. He was failed painting a picture of an autumn scene when they were telling him about how they were going to go through with the operation. They're like, what do you want to name it?
More autumn mist down here. They're like, oh, that's a great name, then. Mein Fuhrer. Kind of the status from the German side of it. On the Eastern Front, the Nazis are in full retreat. This is after Stalingrad and everything. If you're not familiar with that, go back and listen to our episode on it. But Russia has entered Poland up to this point. So they are just moving through and retaking all of this territory. They've liberated most of Belarus. And then after Normandy, there was the breakout in July. So it kind of took almost a month to kind of establish a pocket there where they could start bringing in Allied troops. And that was our only place that we were able to bring in troops and supplies that had been secured. And then once they had amassed enough, forces and enough supplies, they were able to kind of do a breakout. Now, it's a slow moving breakout because if you're only able to bring in supplies from Britain, and you're only able to bring them through on these mulberry harbors, these temporary harbors that they were able to set up in Normandy. If you try to move too fast, you're outrunning your supply lines. You can't get gas for your vehicles. You can't get arms to your troop. They're useless. They're just going to, if they get too far out in front, the enemy can just counterattack and push right through them.
We talked about this during Stalingrad. This is what affected the Germans trying to take Stalingrad was they moved too quickly past how their supply lines could help feed that fighting force, and they just kind of stalled. And in this situation, all of the preparations that we took for the D-Day landings by bombing railways and all of that kind of stuff, bombing supply or fuel supply depots or anything like that, it's all now hampering us because now that we've set foot on Normandy, how do you spread out when you just blew up all the railways leading out of Normandy?
It's the biggest catch. You had to do that stuff to allow yourself to capture Normandy because the Germans could have just used it to bring up supplies and troops to try to push you back. But now that you're there, you have to have a way to then transport and spread out in the opposite direction, and you've kind of fucked that up a little bit with all the sabotage and the bombing.
Exactly, and your troops are also very worn out because they just went through the D-Day invasion. And not only that, as soon as this breakout happens, it's not like they're just marching straight towards Paris unabated. They're being messed with all the time. There's skirmishes happening. Plus, your travel time is insane getting from place to place, whether it's in the back of a 10-ton truck taking you to the next location, whether you're marching, you're probably dragging some supplies. I know on the German side, they said that a lot of their artillery was still pulled by horses. Were we using horses?
We were mostly, no, because you would have had to bring them over.
That's a fair point. Yeah. It'd be pretty dumb to fill a boat full of horses just to bring them across.
Okay, does that look weird? You drive out a tank out of one of those landing craft that pulls up to the beach, and then all of a sudden you see guys clopping out on horses.
So they come up with this brilliant strategy. Supplies were running low, and the only port of entry that they had for supplies was over the beach because you didn't have enough deep harbors to be able to land anywhere and make it happen.
Well, kind of like we referred to back in the D-Day episode, these port cities that exist around the coast of France and everything, these have all been basically turned into fortresses because they're the points where you would want to capture them the most, because then you can bring in, it's already an established port where ships can be unloaded very quickly. Larger ships that carry more supplies can come into those deep harbors. And so places like Cherbourg, Antwerp, and a lot of these other coastal cities are basically just locked down by the Nazis.
Well, we even take Cherbourg, but the issue is on the German retreat, they wreck and mine the harbor. So you can't do anything if you don't have any infrastructure there. We end up also, that the Allies end up taking Antwerp, which is great. They capture it fully intact in early September. Unfortunately, it would not be fully operational until the end of November. And the other issue in Antwerp was the Shield River estuary. I believe it's called Schilt, maybe. River estuary was occupied by Germans on both sides.
So Antwerp was a little bit, it wasn't like on the coast with ocean access. There was an estuary where you had to travel up the river a little bit. But the port, was enormous. We had to capture one of these points in order to start getting supplies flowing in so we could actually kind of start making actual progress. Around this time in August, between the landings at Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge, you also have Operation Dragoon, which, badass name, but also drop the extra O. Operation Dragon.
What does Dragoon mean?
I don't know. I can't be as cool as a fucking dragon.
Probably not. I was thinking of Rangoon. Dragon Rangoon.
You also have Operation Market Garden that's happening at this point as well. Now, Operation Market Garden was, as far as airborne was concerned, it was larger than even D-Day. And when Operation Market Garden, the objectives were to essentially try to secure passage over the Rhine River, essentially through, I think, the Netherlands. So try to liberate the Netherlands and then also try to get access through Germany that way. If you could also take the Netherlands, I believe it may have also had access points that you could start bringing in troops. Well, that actually went tits up. Operation Market Garden was known as mostly as a failure.
Why? Who led Market Garden?
That would have been Monty.
Bernard
Montgomery?
His first name?
Bernard Montgomery, isn't
Bernard Montgomery. He was the lieutenant.
So if you're breaking up the structure, and someone's going to fucking call us out on this because details everyone. But as far as the command structure, you have King Dick at the top, which is Ike. You have the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, Eisenhower. Down below him, you then actually have either British commanders or you have American commanders. You're not going to put British troops who have been training under British commanders and everything. They have their own way of doing something. You're going to leave them.
Time.
Yeah. You're going to leave them with their own people. That's also something I think is probably a little bit confusing about World War II is we're fighting as allies, but you're still staying within your own armies. You may be under the command of one supreme commander, but essentially you're staying with your unit because you have your own way of doing things. You have your own weapons. So it doesn't make sense to provide a unit with ammo and weapons that have to fit multiple soldiers. You kind of keep your guys separate, but you work as a cohesive unit. If you're under this commander, he could be put in charge of your army, and then you move and flow along with his army. So you have Bernard Montgomery, who's kind of the main guy for on the British side. And then you have a few different guys, Omar Bradley, and then like General Patton. You have a few different guys that are in different positions that are kind of the main American guys.
Question and observation. I'll start out with the observation. Omar Bradley is the first Omar I've ever seen to be a white man. Kind of surprising. And second part of that question, along with another person that was over there, General Abrams. Are Bradley and Abrams where we get the names for the tanks?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
There's also the I think you're thinking, so the Abrams would be the tank.
Yes.
And I believe Bradley is the fighting vehicle. It's an armored APC, an armored personnel carrier.
But probably were
yeah, I'm sure.
Okay.
Just like, Sherman. That's where they got the Sherman tanks, was because wasn't there William Tecumseh Sherman during the
Sherman's March?
During the Civil War, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you also have a situation where the U.S. Air Force has actually been bombing and able to bomb Germany since about August of 1942. Now, in varying levels, because if you're flying over and you don't have any area in Europe or mainland Europe to fly from, you're having to fly all your missions from England. That's already cutting into your distance that you can actually travel. What that's also doing is your fighter planes that can be escorting your bombers to keep them safe from enemy fighters don't have the fuel capacity in the range. So they really can't protect them. So these bombing missions aren't as successful until we establish air dominance. And we had air dominance before the Normandy landings, which is why they were able to actually be done. Like Adam was saying, these guys had been, off and on fighting for like 6 months. They're tired. They're fucking battle fatigued. You got to imagine PTSD is kicking in for everybody. Like the first day you're there, you're just some kid who's never seen someone die before. And all of a sudden you're either storming the beach and you're seeing people getting blown apart. You're jumping out of a fucking airplane and maybe like one of your guys takes a round in the head that you can see while he's coasting down, with his chute. But you're asked to keep stepping in and stepping in. There's areas where your troops have to be kept close, but you do have to get them off the line and send them to recuperate. You're also taking losses to units where you can't just come in with like a company or a unit and lose 30%, 40% of its fighting strength and then just keep it there and say, hey, we're just sticking with this group of guys. If we lose them all, we lose them all. You have to be replenished by reinforcements and have guys plugged into your unit. So how this would happen, you would get pulled off the front line. I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but you'd get sent to some place that's off the front, but you're not usually getting sent back like to England. That was something that happened on occasion, but you're trying to be sent someplace safe, but close enough to where you can still be used if you really need to.
Almost in essence like a cooler part of the war behind the front lines.
Someplace where you're not in danger, where you can do training with your new guys to bring them up to speed.
But there's still guns everywhere.
Yes. So you have this situation where all of a sudden there's this place that is in, I want to say Belgium, and it's on the other side, kind of the northwestern side of the Ardennes forest. And basically this area, weirdly enough, is where Hitler launched the Blitzkrieg against France. And the reason why he was so successful is because they were like, well, no one's going to attack through the Ardennes forest. It's nothing but really densely wooded, a lot of ravines, a lot of mountains, and not that many roads. And so the French didn't really defend that area because they didn't believe that anyone would mount an attack through there. Well, even in 1944, kind of the same belief somehow from the Allies. And so a lot of units are sending their, guys that are coming off the front lines into the Ardennes forest or kind of on the other side of it. They're, defending it and everything, but it's supposed to be kind of a quieter area where they can kind of rest and recuperate.
Yeah, and along these same lines, the Ardennes forest stands right in front of the port in Antwerp. So they're able to be supplied a lot easier. One of the massive ways that they were able to spread, I want to talk about the liberation of Paris just to keep pounding that Monty drum.
Yeah.
They use something called the Red Ball Express. Now, the Red Ball Express, I rabbit holed pretty quickly. I think I heard it in one or two documentaries.
I'm glad you did, because I knew that as soon as I saw what that was, that's what was going to get your goat.
Yeah, to think about how the logistics of moving troops moving supplies to troops that are marching if you don't have a railway, there's just only so many ways that you can do it. So this Red Ball Express, the reason it's called the Red Ball Express is because something about the Santa Fe train system in the 1850s used to use a red ball to
Designate
perishable items inside of train cars. So the Red Ball Express would have these trucks. They were 2.5-ton trucks. They were called deuce and a half, which
baby.
at the same time seems odd to me because it's the same amount of syllables and it's actually less letters than 2.5.
Sounds cooler.
But 2.5-ton trucks. And they pulled them from all the different units. It was just extra trucks that they had. Almost 3/4 of these drivers were black soldiers. They stepped in and they filled this void that they needed. This guy named Colonel Loren Ayers was known as Little Patton, which is got to be a pretty sweet thing to be known by.
Wasn't Patton kind of little anyway?
Littler Patton. But he was in charge of this Red Ball Express. And these guys would drive 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At their peak, there were, what was it? It was almost 6,000 trucks in operation.
All of those coming over.
Yeah.
Probably some of those trying to be like, if you were able to drive Germans off, you're probably also using some of their shit, anything you could get your hands on. But for the most part, all of that being brought over, either on those mulberry harbors, the harbors, those temporary harbors, or once they had taken Antwerp. Now, just to kind of touch on that before we get back into the Red Ball Express, the reason Antwerp was so important, like we were saying, is if you had a port that could support like larger ships and a lot of them, that was a game changer.
Oh, yeah.
And I think Antwerp, they said, of course, I can't find it in my notes now. Oh, God damn it. This is where I'm actually going to cut and then put something else in. Where? Okay. So Antwerp could support 1,000 ships at a time.
1,000 ships at a time?
1,000 ships at a time in this insane harbor. Because it's the city was one of those cities that stretched along the entirety, like part of the coast. So there was harbor all the way down and all these little individual ones.
But wasn't this where you had to get in through the estuary?
It was, but it was... So basically when they're talking about the estuary, that thing could be huge, man. Like, think of like...
Oh, shit. Okay. Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
Port of Antwerp is massive.
Well, think of it this way, too. Where were all the German boats? That was on the river, and then they had to sail it up. So that was also... You can have these huge, insane, port cities that are just a little bit, more tucked inland.
Yeah.
So once they had this, they were able to just start flowing supplies in, fuel for everything. And this scared the shit out of Hitler. But until that happened, that didn't happen as far as capturing Antwerp until September 4th of 44. And the harbor wasn't usable because they had mined it. They had mined part of the river and the estuary. And they also had to, repair any structural damage. It was still in pretty decent shape. They weren't able to start using that until November.
Well, so Monty also had to clear the Germans from each side of the estuary, too.
That's true. So for this entire period, from the beginning of June until November, it's all relying on this Red Ball Express.
Yeah, and these dudes were super efficient. They were dropping off around 12,500 tons of supplies per day. And the way that this would work was each truck required 2 drivers, so that way one of them could be sleeping while the other one's driving, and then vice versa, and switch back and forth. There were 2 routes that were open from Cherbourg, and each convoy consisted of no more than 5 trucks for obvious reasons, because the Luftwaffe, even though they don't have air dominance, they can still send scouting missions to try to knock you out.
It's a lot easier to hide 5 trucks driving along than it is an entire supply line. And you're much less of a appealing target if someone's just like, there's only 5 there. It's going to be kind of hard to hit one of those.
They were escorted by 1 Jeep in the front and 1 Jeep in the back of these envoys. For security reasons, obviously, but at the same time, they also wanted to keep an eye on the Red Ball Express because they said it wouldn't be odd for a soldier to sell off a cache of supplies, make a little money, put it in their pockets. But these guys weren't experienced drivers of these trucks. So one of the major issues that they had was just grinding gears, trying to get from point A to point B. Mm-hmm. And they said that the number of gearboxes that they changed out was like they couldn't even keep track of it. These guys went through, I believe it was 40,000 tires just through this Red Ball Express. Each one of the trucks had governors that would limit them to 56 miles an hour. And it was pretty common that the first thing they would do when they got a truck was to rip the governor out so they could go even faster.
Well, fuck yeah. All of a sudden, if one of these Luftwaffe planes does, find your group and pick you out, you're not going to be like, oh man, we're just going to have to travel this consistent speed. He's going to be able to get a beat on us.
Yeah, but just to think, almost 6,000 trucks were in operation at its peak. And we're talking about a matter of from, August, maybe, to they cut it off a little bit after, a little bit before the Bulge. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about a matter of a couple months. They had 6,000 trucks that were supplying all of these soldiers on the front lines and just going all the time. I think they said at one point in time, there was always 36 trucks on the road traveling. Like at any point, that was the minimum amount that would be out on the road.
You could just call up, when am I getting my next load of supplies? Within the next few hours, probably.
Yeah.
Percentage, yeah. So you have a situation in which they have a foothold. The Allies are pushing. They've liberated Paris. They've liberated a good portion of northern France. Again, they haven't liberated all of France or gotten into like Vichy France or anything like that. But they've got enough of a foothold that they're pretty much just going to be able to keep supplying and then spreading out. And if you want to try to starve them and be able to hold them, you need to cut off the supplies. Try to starve them out. And so Hitler has this idea, Operation Watch on the Rhine, Autumn Mist, Ardennes Offensive, that they need to launch one massive, basically like offensive against the Allies in order to, his reasoning was that of a madman, which at this point he was hopped up on all kinds of shit. So this might make sense to his, whatever he was on affecting his mind.
Well, his reasonings for doing it and why he thought that they could do it honestly don't seem like the craziest thing in the world.
Okay, so I'll list them off and then you tell me feasibility of this working. Okay. First of all, he had to try to give them a bloody nose to make them think that they were still fighting. They still had a good enough fighting force to defend itself, but also he had heard rumors, between Montgomery and Bradley and those other guys that there was some dissension or some conflicts between the British and the Americans. And he thought also that if he could launch this attack, he could both physically and also figuratively drive a wedge between the Americans and the British, both in the attack itself, in which he'd be separating their forces. And then also he thought that this could somehow cause infighting and that the leadership would actually just fall apart for the Allies.
I don't know if he was completely wrong.
Let's do a 1 to 10. What's the feasibility? Like, how sane is that one? Thought?
To me, there's a difference between him not being wrong and it being totally insane. Because, like, what I was about to say was he wasn't wrong in that there was infighting. Because at the top of the pyramid, Roosevelt and Churchill were pretty much in lockstep.
Yeah.
They were agreed upon everything, all that kind of stuff. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, was the guy. Unfortunately, that's where the kind of in lockstep ends.
Well, that's where you got the division of both nationality, military ideology, that kind of shit.
Well, and bravado, too. Because
yes, everyone vying for, like, trying to suckle at Eisenhower's teats.
Guys like Montgomery that believe that they should be leading the force because maybe he wants credit, maybe he feels like he can do a better job.
Well, you guys are stationed in Great Britain, and we've been holding the line this entire time. Why are you guys stepping in ahead of me? We're the ones that have been fighting. We know what's going on. And it got to the point where when they stepped in and it was chosen for Eisenhower to be there, they were just like, the Americans were just like, yeah, but look at all the shit that we've been bringing in. And look at all the men we're going to bring in. Like, if we're going to bring them in, we'll still put you in a position to kind of run your own guys. But this guy's going to be making the decisions for everybody.
All the time that you've been holding the line, you've been holding American supplies at the same time.
And technically, by the line, you mean you just haven't been invaded as far as the island of Great Britain, because they still have all of France.
Yeah. So in that vein, I don't think necessarily that he was wrong. The insane part of that thought process is to ever think that those differences could come between beating Germany.
Would actually effectively break up the Allied powers.
So he was right in the thinking that there was dissension among the ranks.
He was right in that he was aware of the situation, but he completely misjudged the situation.
He misjudged their hate for him over their hate for each other.
Okay.
Because I truly believe, just listening to some of the things that I have, that this, throwing back to the Suez episode, when we were talking about how Eisenhower just generally condemned the British, I think Montgomery had pissed him off enough to where he was just anti-Britain.
He had a bad British taste in his mouth.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He had a bad crumpet. He had some spotted dick that was on Montgomery, and he just didn't like it anymore. So in that theory, I would say that he's not wrong, but he's also just completely out of his mind. As far as driving the wedge, literally and figuratively, I don't think that would have mattered, because they weren't all, like you said, everybody was pretty unique. Everybody had kind of their own fighting styles. But in order to break them, you would have to not understand that the French Canadians and the French and the British have all still been fighting together, and the Americans know their shit too.
Yeah.
So even if you drive this wedge between them, there's still two very angry fighting forces that are going to be coming after you.
He also had the belief that this would somehow force them into, because at this point, it was an unconditional surrender or bust. That's what it was offered to Germany. Unconditional surrender. We're not going to fucking ticky-tat about any of this shit. He thought that this could essentially bring them to the negotiating table to perhaps do a surrender, or not even a surrender, because that, I don't think he would agree to that word. Some type of armistice on that side, on the side of the West, with America and with Great Britain. His belief at that point was then he could turn all of his attention back toward the East, send all those troops that had been fighting in the West, and push the Russians back and continue that shit with Stalin.
Because there were 4 million Red Army soldiers advancing on the Eastern Front.
And at this point, he apparently wasn't aware of the fact that, and I'm not sure if it was in Casablanca or where it was that they came to this agreement, but Stalin had basically reached the agreement with Churchill and Roosevelt to be like, hey, we're not making separate deals here, right? Everyone, it's unconditional surrender or nothing at all. So there was an agreement between all three of the leadership there that regardless if he thought that, they would, Eisenhower, or not Eisenhower, but Roosevelt and Churchill would have been like, so yeah, we can't actually do that. We got to keep fighting you. But by all means, send your guys back to the Eastern Front, because that's where they probably need to be.
See what happens. See how that goes. We're going to keep pestering you over here on the Western Front. That's not going to go away. So if you just maybe want to try to satiate us over here and try to hold us in one position, send everybody back to Russia. See what happens. Go see what happens after Stalingrad. Go see what happens after you just massacred an entire city, and then they kept everybody that was still alive in the city to try to protect the soldiers.
Yeah.
That's how much he cares about his people over there. So if you guys want to go do that, by all means, have fun.
Hitler was also... This was post-assassination. Well, he had a couple different assassination attempts, but the most famous one was where they attempted to use an explosive device at the Wolf's Lair. And when that happened, he believed that that was the fault of the army. And so going forward, he really didn't trust the army. Now, that's weird to say that you don't trust the army, which makes up the majority of your armed forces. So he put most of his trust in the SS. So if he was going to assign anybody to be able to perform this operation and be successful, he wanted leadership in the hands of the SS. So he actually pulls a pretty good chunk of guys off of the Eastern Front, like some of the crack units that had been like the armored units, like the tanks. He pulled them off the Eastern Front because he knew he had to have them for this basic like thrust through the Allied lines, to basically try to sweep around. They were going to go through the Ardennes, and this is kind of getting into what Hitler's plans for this operation were. he was going to go through the Ardennes, which is a forest that separates Belgium and Luxembourg, is kind of between them. He would then split his forces into like 3 different prongs, or they would attack it, over I think it was a 60 to 75 mile front.
Pretty big front.
Is where this operation was going to take place, through this huge swath of forest. And so they would be attacking in like 3 or 4 different kind of prongs. And as they moved through, the one that was the furthest south was supposed to kind of stay south, but head west a little bit to basically stop any type of reinforcements coming up from the south for the Allies. And that's where Patton was actually at this time. The next one was supposed to go a little bit higher, a little bit more northwest. And then one of the main groups in the middle was supposed to punch through, circle around, cross the Meuse River, which was this huge river. Not like you can build a bridge across it, especially when you're under fire and in unfriendly territory, and then get up to Antwerp, taking the city and taking both sides of the river. How many days did he give them to do this?
Like 2 weeks.
4 days.
Well, 4 days for the initial, but I think 2 weeks was the window that he gave them to do it in.
So this was basically his PowerPoint presentation, and he gave this to his generals on like September 16th in 44.
Well, I know that we keep going back to this. This is a methed up, pilled out Hitler. So the delusion isn't really a large leap to go. But just to put his spot into perspective here, he's 2 years removed, right around, from getting absolutely blown up in Stalingrad, right? Because that was 42?
Yes, I think so.
He's a couple months removed from the D-Day invasion. So the Eastern Front is going very badly. The Western Front, after the D-Day invasion, the breakout, the liberation of Paris, and kind of the fingers of the army coming into Europe, the Western Front's not looking great either, right?
He also now is worried about, because they've landed in southern France.
Yeah.
And he knows what's going on with Mussolini at this time, too.
And so, yeah, you have the North Africa campaign that's not going well for them either. Mm-hmm. And all this is to say, at the exact same time, instead of doing what any other logical person would do and go on the defensive, which is what his generals wanted to do. They wanted a defensive campaign parked at the Rhine and what's the one in Russia?
I can't remember.
We'll get to it. There's a river in Russia.
Makes perfect sense too. And again, this is somebody who made the rank of corporal during World War I. Is basically, and he has this false confidence because up until, well, not really recently, because Stalingrad was, like you said, 42, 43, his ideas in his mind have always worked. He came up with the idea of the Blitzkrieg going through the Ardennes in 1940 when they did the invasion of the fall of France. Operation Barbarossa, just that insane thrust into fucking Russia, getting all the way to Moscow. The losses, the attrition from those losses, he's delusional about that. He doesn't want to come to terms with that. And so in his eyes, he's designing this plan that, well, fuck, we took over the entirety of like France in like 3 weeks to a month.
We didn't do that on the defense.
No. Also, we're just literally trying to take this one city and go through this forest. We should easily be able to do that in like 4 days. So his generals, like you're saying, are coming up to him and saying, our opinion at this point, and they're fully aware of the writing on the wall. Albert Speer, who was the Minister of Armaments for Hitler kind of later on in the war, basically had told him, hey, we have about a year's worth of like armaments. We can make war for about 1 more year. Now that's for armaments. That's not including fuel, all that kind of stuff. So I completely lost my train of thought.
You're losing oil fields by the day on the Eastern Front as the Russians are coming down towards you. You don't have nearly as much of the other resources that you need. Like you were talking about, you have a year's worth of armaments, but at the same time, just having the armaments does you no good if you don't have trained soldiers that are trained well to be able to do it, and any go juice. If you don't have go juice to make these armaments move, there's nothing you can do with those. They're lawn ornaments.
You got me back on track. So Hitler has this overconfidence in what he deems are appropriate plans. His generals, knowing the writing on the wall, being some people that have been involved in the military and in battle, are having to listen to this guy. And 2 of his generals, I think Model and von Reichenauer, or I can't remember exactly who the other one was, basically come up to him and say, hey, why don't we give you some alternative plans that we think would be more successful? Let's set up a defensive area around the Rhine River, which is this huge river.
Oder is the German.
And the Oder. Set up defensive positions, blow up all the bridges or defend them. And basically, how are they going to get across? It's not like, they can keep bombing us, sure. They can keep doing that, but will cost them so much by our defense that maybe we can then get that, some conditions instead of that unconditional surrender. And he's like, 9, nope, my fucking plan's going through. So he's giving them this PowerPoint. He's like, okay, day 1. I feel like this is the Michael Scott, it's a 50-day plan, one plan each day, 50th day we're saved.
Well, before you get into this, just to lay out what the Western Front looks like, there's 96 Allied divisions that were at the front with more following on the daily. At that
point, it was a huge front, though.
Yeah. At that point in time, and this is why the huge front comes into play, at that point in time, the Germans had about 55 kind of less than sort of inferior divisions that were at play in the Western Front.
I think it also, the divisions between, the German divisions, numbers varied. They also varied between, divisions and stuff like that, even between, the British and the Americans, I believe. So strengths kind of vary, but the Allies definitely had, the strength in numbers. One thing, too, is, they're not able, and during 1944, somehow that was the year in which Germany was able to produce the most amount of war materials. And we talked about this a little bit before the podcast. I think that might have been just because they had so much of the country dedicated to cranking that out, emergency footing, to where everybody's making bombs, everyone's making bullets, everyone's making tanks. But like you said, you've lost so many people over on the Eastern Front. There have to be skilled people to drive these, and to fight, and to hit something, and to fly these planes. And that's
to train the people
to
fly
train the
planes.
people.
Yeah, there's just, they've invested so much, and I would assume that probably the reason that it was max capacity was potentially because they weren't using as much, because they weren't in the middle of Stalingrad anymore.
Yeah.
This was a little bit after potentially the D-Day invasion or not being able to get it there. So they had a little bit of a manufacturing backup, I'm sure, to where they had a lot of supply in their hand.
They weren't having to spread out as much.
Yeah. Well, and I think Albert Speer, for as just awful as a person that he was, he seemed like a fairly efficient, slave-driving asshole that was really good at manufacturing things. Just because he's a bad person doesn't mean he was not good at being a bad person. So you were talking about the first day's plan in this 1944 PowerPoint, which I'm sure was probably not good.
Z PowerPoint.
The first day, Walter Modell, that Chris mentioned, his Army Group B was to complete the action while bringing reinforcements to the Ardennes, or through the Ardennes. So he was supposed to break through, and he was supposed to take the center point of the Ardennes, where I believe Bastogne was. He was supposed to reach the River Meuse that you were talking about. They wanted to take Liege, and they wanted to take Dinant too by the third day. So he wanted the penetration, he wanted moving through the Ardennes, and he wanted to take Meuse, Liege, and Dinant in 3 days.
Okay. So, day 1, pierce the lines. Day 2, get all the armor through the forest. Day 3, reach the river, which was 103 miles away from where they were going from. And then day 4, they were to seize Antwerp, which was another 80 miles. And the West Bank. They were supposed to have that locked down in 4 days. Funny caveat about this, that distance, they had enough fuel to move the amount of vehicles that they dedicated to this about 70 miles. And so the German commanders are like, we can get 70 miles on the fuel that we have. I think they said they were able to get together for the operation 5 million gallons of fuel for this. And that had to run for this operation. I think they had 300,000 men, 2,100 tanks and assault guns, and then 1,900 artillery pieces and 1,000 aircraft.
Well, part of the reason why they had that big of a supply to do this mission was because after all of their losses at D-Day, Speer was able to just ramp up, and I want to say that he replaced most or all of the Panzer tank divisions that were lost on D-Day by the time this was coming around.
And I don't know if like the Nazis used that as propaganda, because there weren't a ton of tank divisions that they got. This wasn't like on the German front where like there were tank battles. Because again, on
the Eastern Front, you mean?
On the Eastern Front. Yeah. Because again, D-Day, you're not bringing a ton of tanks ashore. It's just trying to establish that foothold.
Yeah, well, that's part of it too, is all the tanks destroyed on D-Day may have been a fairly small number to replace.
But imagine that. We've already been able to, but it's like 20 tanks. It's like we replaced them already. So with the tanks and the assault guns, and this is a crazy, just boring, probably nerdy World War II fact. So there were tanks, and then there were tank hunters and tank killers.
Yes.
Okay. So as I understand it, because I rabbit holed on this to try to figure out the difference, the tanks would essentially be multi-use vehicles, really thick armor, really powerful gun, had to have a lot of survivability, had to be able to get a lot of places, had to be able to provide, mobile cover for troops and everything. So they had to be built very sturdily, very reliable.
And huge.
And they weighed a ton. They weren't very fast because of that, and they burned a lot more gas. Then you had tank hunters, which were, and when you look at a picture of them, you're like, that's a fucking tank. So the tank hunters were essentially lightly armored. I think they could travel up to like 50 miles an hour, and they just had a big gun on it. So basically it was a lightly armored, just big ass gun that was supposed to be mobile enough to try to take out enemy tanks. That's exactly where a tank could essentially lay down and take on infantry as well with all the machine guns. Tank killers were just supposed to go after tanks. The Germans had developed this new tank called the Tiger II, or I think the King Tiger. It was their they kept getting bigger and fucking bigger as the war went on. This insane tank, it held their largest anti-aircraft caliber type gun or mortar gun. It was the 88. It might have been even bigger than that. But it was basically the biggest gun out there on the battlefield and could kill anything that the Allies had. Well, they were able to get together, I think maybe 70 of these things to use in this operation. And the additional tanks were smaller models, Panzers, previous Tiger models and everything. But the Germans also used a ton of these tank killers. And these are the ones that you see that are literally just the vehicle with the gun sticking out the front. It can't really pivot. It doesn't have a wide range of motion. And they would just take all these tank chassis, and instead of having to take all of the resources, you could probably get, from a material perspective, because the armor and everything, you could probably get 3 or 4 tank killers out of the material that it would take to make one tank, just with the thickness of the metal and the technology and the turret rotation and all that shit.
Yeah, if you don't care about heavy armor, you can pound that real thin and just put a shell on the outside of it.
Yeah. And so they had a ton of these tank hunters as well. So, I mean, they are really ramping up what they have, and they're having to move it close enough to the Ardennes to where they can't be noticed, but also to the fact when they launch their operation, they can just basically try to do a blitzkrieg again.
What's the problem with doing a blitzkrieg through the forest when you have tanks that are almost twice the size of the tanks that did it the first time?
Well, they don't fit.
Yep.
They're too heavy.
Yep.
You're still using engines that worked on previous tanks, and so they're overly stressed. You haven't tested them because they're newer. They're unreliable. They're breaking down. And so some of these things that were supposed to be these big advantages that the Germans were going to have are kind of just moot points because you can't even get them in there.
Well, not to mention, if you're in the middle of a forest and you don't know where to fire, it's not going to be as effective. You can have the strongest gun in the world, but if you don't know where to fire it, that's not going to help.
You want to make the heaviest tank, it can still be destroyed with enough hits on it.
Yeah.
And what's going to happen when someone disables your heaviest tank you've ever created in the middle of a narrow forest road?
Roadblock.
You just blocked up that entire road, and you probably have nothing that can move that tank, especially if that thing just got knocked out. It means you're under fire. And guess what? That's another road that's off the use map for getting through the Ardennes.
Well, there were so many other parts of this just besides the ground, because Allied air superiority just left the Germans grounded. The Luftwaffe wasn't able to go out and collect battlefield intelligence to take pictures of any of this stuff. So if you don't have a solid plan and you don't know where these I want to say the word installments. I don't think that's the right.
Installations?
Installations are where these troops are, what you need to watch out for. It's going to cause you a lot of problems. And if you can't get a plane up in the air to take pictures or to draw you a map, anything like that, you're kind of going in blind.
And at this point, because the Allies had taken a pretty sizable portion of Western France, now all of a sudden you're not flying your bombers and your fighters off out of the UK anymore. You've moved them over. You're still flying those guys out of there because you're still bombing areas that are closer to Great Britain than to, France.
Yeah.
But you're bringing in all those fighters that can provide close air support for all of your troops. So the fact that you now have those fighters there, that completely knocks, like you said, that reconnaissance aspect out of the way. But at the same time, now they have a lot more planes in the air. Now they can see a lot more of our movements. So this entire movement of troops and forces, part of the reason the Ardennes was also picked was because of all of the trees providing cover once they moved, these forces through there. They would be much harder to see. Getting all your forces there was going to be an issue because planes were flying around all the time during the day. So you're forced to do all of this setup by moving these things at night, and not only moving them at night, but sometimes doing it in the dark, because if you're an airplane and you're flying, and this is in war-torn France, Belgium, Luxembourg, that type area, not a lot of power, not a lot of lights on at night.
No.
So you have nights where everything is completely pitch black. So if you see any headlights, chances are that it's not going to be, Dave and Nancy down the street out for a leisurely drive. This is probably going to be an enemy force if they're in a place that you don't occupy.
Well, we're laying out as two guys who live in the United States that are pro-U.S. forces. We're laying out why this plan sounds so bad and all the holes that we can poke in it. But even the German generals, the commanders, because what ends up happening was Model commands Army Group B. This guy that Chris brought up earlier, von Rundstedt,
not von Reichenauer,
commanded the army in the West for this operation. There was a point in time when von Rundstedt heard the Allies calling it the von Rundstedt operation. And he's like, this wasn't me. I didn't want to be a part of this. I didn't agree with any of this. Please stop calling it that.
Nope. That wasn't me.
Yeah. These guys are trying to wash their hands of this. But the fact that Goering is standing there with the rest of the SS, these guys can't turn down any of these promotions.
I was thinking about that too. I kind of, put that question forward to you about why didn't any of these guys just of course the SS is in the room, right? Especially after the assassination attempt.
Oh, yeah.
If you're not agreeing with him, you're probably going to get taken out, back shot, and then replaced with the next guy in line. But at the same time, I guess the guys on the front really don't know this is going to fail. It's just the guys that are actually telling them that it's going to succeed. They have to tell them it's going to succeed.
Well, and when you lead with, we did this exact same thing in 1940, it's going to be a piece of cake.
Thank God it's France. Going back to the gasoline thing, I remember what I was wanting to say on that. So 5 million gallons for this. That was enough for the operation to run for 6 days. And so he's shown them this plan. They see obviously how much gas they have. And they're like, 6 days? He's like, you're going to be done in 4. I've given you 4 to get the operation. So you have 2 extra days of gas. And in their heads, they're thinking, fuck, no. That's insane. You have to prepare for, every outcome. And he's like, okay, so what you guys will do is you guys are going to push through them so fast, they're going to have to run and leave all of these stockpiles of fuel that they have, and we'll just use their gas to keep it going. And they're just looking at him, and he's like, yep, it'll work. We're just going to go ahead and take over their fuel depots, and that's how we'll go ahead and get the fuel to continue moving. So you guys are all set there. Again, you have 2 extra days just on the fuel that we've provided you.
Well, it's one thing to send troops in and be like, instead of having supplies, you're just going to kind of have to live off the land. Whatever you can find, you can eat or anything like that. You can't really bank on living off the land with fuel.
Yeah.
Because these fuel dumps that are around, while they will be handy, and it is the same kind of fuel that runs their tanks that runs yours, so it'll be just fine. You can use all that kind of stuff. You have to get to it, and they have to not destroy it before you get to it. but you also have to find them too. And they're not just going to be out hanging out somewhere
I
in
assume they
plain
would
sight.
be probably in strategic
Yeah.
areas, like where roads access and everything like that would occur. So the Allied advantage throughout this whole thing leading up to December, overwhelming man and supply superiority. They were bringing in supplies just consistently. And the longer the Germans waited, the worse it was going to get for them, because you were just going to get more troops and more tanks and everything like that. They had air superiority. They were bombing deep into Western Germany by this point. And then basically, Germany had been through the ringer. They had been beat to shit over on the Eastern Front. And me and Adam have gone back and forth on this, not even arguing, but just kind of marveling at the fact. This was, the United States was heavily involved in the war, kind of from the beginning in the terms of like material support, fuel, war materials, all that kind of stuff to keep Britain and, Russia in the fight.
We were a military sugar daddy.
Yep. When it got to the point where it could be at a tipping point, and we saw that, there was the likelihood that we could essentially be kind of that extra push, we got in there. D-Day was planned. That occurred, and we got boots on the ground. At that point, they were thinking, again, we've referenced this before, home by Christmas. Well, turned out to be a little bit different, but the simple fact is the amount of losses that the Germans had on the Eastern Front is why the casualties on the Western Front aren't even close to the same amounts. And so Germany had just been beat to shit. And when guys were being pulled off of the Eastern Front, they weren't really being sent to just like rest and recuperate. It's just like, no, we're going to send you to the Western Front, but it's so much fucking easier there. So it's just going to be kind of like a sandals for you.
The Western Front was like the Ardennes for the United States military.
That's pretty much what it was, except it was the entire Western Front and they were still, kind of fighting.
They're just fighting four countries.
And so, I mean, that's definitely an advantage on our side. Disadvantages, like Adam kind of alluded to before, you had troops that were tired after weeks of combat and movement. Not everybody's being moved by trucks or trains and everything. Sometimes you're marching, for days at a time. And then supply lines were pretty much thin and they were getting depleted. And there was an argument, up in high command. There was like Monty wanting the redirection of what limited supplies they did have to have, he favored, I think the big kind of difference in ideology was that I think Bradley and like Eisenhower favored just a wide front approach. They wanted to pretty much create a line and just completely push them back out of the area. They wanted to go, I think at one point it went from Switzerland all the way up to like the English Channel. And they wanted to just slowly but surely push them back to not allow any pockets of like German resistance to remain. And then basically once that occurs, everything behind you as you're pushing the line forward is all in support of you.
Yeah.
Bradley was like, or not Bradley, but Montgomery was basically like, no, we need to just launch a thrust into Germany and try to drive toward Berlin or get as deep as we can. And then we can just push out and widen that as we go. And so that was his thought. And then on the other side of it, it was like, we need to do this slow front. So there was some argument about like redirection of supplies. So that was kind of one of the disadvantages as well, because that really didn't help funnel them to any specific place, especially not the place where you're not expecting to be attacked and you're sending your depleted units.
Well, to take that just on surface face level, there's disagreements that happen inside the military all the time.
Mm-hmm.
This has a little bit more steam on it, and we've pointed out Monty a couple times. To our female listeners, I'm sorry for using this, but this just kind of fits for him. Montgomery was kind of a little bitch.
Monty's a bitch.
During the liberation of France, they were going to have a celebration, and Montgomery was invited to this celebration in France for the liberation. And Montgomery declined and said, we still have a war to win. I'm not going to take my foot off the pedal and go celebrate with you guys. A major key victory coming back, liberating Paris, one of the largest cities in Europe. And he was so angry that they didn't use his strategies during the D-Day invasions that he didn't want to go hang out with them and celebrate in this big victory.
I can see his attitude, but I don't think, like you were saying, I think it was born out of that kind of a spite instead of just the drive to be like, respectfully, I still want to go make plans to do this. Because had he been on board with all of their plans and everything, and he would have said that, that's respectable to be like, he's the job's not done.
But just take a day.
No, I understand that, but he was doing that for spiteful reasons, to just be like, I'm not celebrating with you because this wasn't my idea.
Yeah, and that's sort of the approach that Montgomery takes, and that Hitler kind of correctly called. But again, like we say, no matter how much Eisenhower despised Montgomery, and no matter how much Montgomery despised anybody that didn't ever agree with him, it didn't matter, because the main objective was to wipe Germany off the map.
Yeah.
So there was never going to be an argument that was too big.
All right, well, we're about to actually kick off the battle itself. Let's take a bathroom break before we do. Well, hey there, all you sexy historians. How you guys doing?
It is time for
socials.
Where can they find us on Instagram?
If they want to follow us, they can find us at Historically High Pod on Instagram.
That goes the same for Threads as well. You can also find us on Twitter.
Ooh, tell them about Twitter.
Historically High. That's Historically HI on Twitter.
And if you want to email any of your comments or suggestions, where can they find us at, Adam?
At Historically High Podcast at gmail.com.
Gmail. All right, and back to the show. All right, so we come to December 16th, and crazy reason for picking that date, but one of the things that they needed, to actually pull this, or even have a whiff of a chance to pull this off, was they had to take the Allied Air Force out of it. So they needed to pick a time when, weather would actually keep air support from happening, or reconnaissance from happening. And so Hitler brings in the weatherman, and the weatherman tells him there's going to be this 2-week period starting was it the 15th or the 16th, that this will be what you need for your operation. He's like, fantastic. You've saved the Reich. Have this gold watch, I think is what he gave him, he gave him a gold watch. I'm pretty confident that guy's dead. And when I say dead, I don't just mean of natural causes.
No.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that guy was probably killed after the first week or second week in the sky, or the first week in the skies cleared up a little bit. Yeah, Hitler probably was like, get that guy back in here. I want that watch back, amongst other things.
I personally would bet that watch is still in a family who had grandparents or great-grandparents that were involved in the SS.
Did it come from a long line of meteorologists?
Oh, no. It's not in a meteorologist family's hands. Somebody killed him and took that watch.
You had asked me if you thought that guy was going to be one of the targets for Operation Paperclip.
No, he's...
I don't think he was on their radar.
The thought of what we look at as meteorologists now on the news, I trust a meteorologist as far as I can throw him. And it's, even today, it seems like a science that doesn't quite register to me. I'm sure that meteorology is probably more accurate than I give it credit for. And I think that there's a lot of scientific things that go into it, and a lot of computers and models and predictions and shit like that. 1944, we don't have a computer.
You don't have radar.
Nah.
Radar is still so new. Yeah, I don't know what you're doing. Where are you getting your reports from?
Hot air balloons.
And yeah, you're just licking a finger and holding up and being like, well, my knees are starting to hurt, so I guess it's going to rain.
Yeah, that's probably what it was. Whenever joints started to hurt.
He just had a collection of people he consulted with on whose joints hurt to what, and then would just base his weather. It had to have been Farmer's Almanac type shit, right?
Could be.
He looked in the area and he said, hey, what does the weather normally look like? How much snow do they get?
I don't think the Farmer's Almanac breaks it down into a weekly period, though.
You know what? Hitler trusted it, so it's got to be a reliable resource, right?
Yeah, he's never banked on anything that was unreliable. Just to kind of set the stage for this, how bad the fighting was, and just kind of when it takes place, because two Christian nations, I believe, they had to be. Germany was Christian, right?
I think so.
Two Christian nations, I guess 3-4 Christian nations, are all about to fight, and fighting kicks off December 16th. Fighting carries all the way through Christmas and into January, even though it was kind of mop up after Christmas. But there was a teacher in Belgium that had come back to their classroom after all the fighting had happened. And this is a direct rip from our history uncle, Dan Snow. I heard this on the podcast, and he's fantastic. Love the guy. Once the restraining order is lifted, I'd really like for Chris and I to be able to meet him in person again.
It's not on me. It's
Okay.
not against me.
All right. Well, you're less.
You're the guys that have been sending me naked pictures.
He didn't say not to.
Sorry, dude.
There was a writing on this chalkboard, and it was from a German officer. It says, "May the world never again live through such a Christmas night. Nothing is more horrible than meeting one's fate far from mother, wife, and children. Is it worthy of a man's destiny to bereave a mother of her son, a wife of her husband, or children of their father? Life was bequeathed to us in order that we might love and be considerate to one another. From the ruins out of blood and death shall come forth a brotherly world." Signed, a German officer. So Chris and I have this talk all the time, and I don't know if we're ever going to be able to change each other's minds, but I am in full belief that most of the soldiers that fought in the army were probably pretty pro-Hitler. I think that for a point in time, he was probably had a majority of the people's support behind him. And the reason that quote makes me kind of think that, but also otherwise, is he talks about man's destiny. And Hitler always talked about the destiny of Germany and all of that kind of stuff. So that leads me to believe that he still had that mindset of that Germany's destiny, a German's destiny was to win this war.
Yeah, you'll never really know what side he was approaching that from.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, the fact that he took time to write that and write about what the kind of war was that they were fighting, he wasn't fully in on the Kool-Aid, because if he was, he wouldn't have written that.
But again, this is the conversation and the point that I always try to make. Even if it was 50-50, even if it was 45-55, or, 55 pro-Nazi, 45 not, a lot of those 45% are still going to be conscripted and be fighting, almost as many as the 55%. So you could have the same type of shit in the army or the Luftwaffe or whatever, where you have 49% that are like, I don't know why we're fucking doing this, and the other 55% being like fucking Heil.
Well, again, this example's anecdotal at best because it's just one example. But I do wonder if there is ever a way to know that question. And I'm sure there's a historian that has the answer to that question. But thinking about it, unless you really got a full poll of everyone, any numbers of support for Hitler within Germany after he took over are always just going to be 100% pro-Hitler because he was the one that was creating the statistics.
Yeah, and it's also going to be kind of like on a curve. As the war goes on and people are starting to tell it might not be going great, that support's going to keep going down. So yeah, it could have been high at the very beginning, but as soon as people stop, their father stopped coming home, their son stopped coming home, and they figure out how many people he sent to die on the fucking Eastern Front and all this type of shit, he's probably going to start losing some support fast. But again, he still has the SS. He's still in control of everything. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m., 1,600 pieces of artillery begin their assault for 90 straight minutes across the entire 80-mile front. So basically, in the dark, they've moved all of their guns up into position, and they're starting their artillery bombardment. Now, I had Adam watch this. Did you get through the whole episode, or did you just hit the highlights?
I think I will say one of the probably top 5 weirdest things I've ever fallen asleep to.
Okay, yeah.
But I am confident I got through at least 40 minutes of it.
So
I certainly got through the scene of the episode where the dude gets mowed across the throat with the machine gun.
Okay.
That was a lot.
Yeah. So Band of Brothers has an episode about Bastogne, and Bastogne is kind of what gets the focal point of the Battle of the Bulge, but there's so much else that goes on around it. our focal point is going to kind of be on everything. We're not just going to focus on Bastogne and that area, but that's where a lot of the action and kind of the stuff it's most known for. So, of course, we got to hit the greatest hits. But you have an example there, and people that have watched it, military historians, guys that have been through it, say that it's a fairly accurate representation of what it would be like to be in like an artillery barrage. So you basically have these soldiers that know something's going to be happening. There's already some information coming around. So they've moved some soldiers into like positions kind of on the outside. They have essentially in the Ardennes, they have a perimeter. Again, they're not expecting a lot of action, but it's not just like they've got their backs turned toward and they're not guarding anything. It's very sparse though. And it's basically almost kind of like what they consider a tripwire line. Whoever sees someone coming through, their job is to maybe delay them a little bit, but their intention isn't to stop them. They know that that's not going to happen, but they're going to notify back further, down the line or deeper into the area. And all of a sudden reinforcements are going to be able to focus in on where this attack is happening.
No, this line is almost more of like if you see something, say something, as opposed to dug into a foxhole with your gun drawn at all times.
Yes.
You're more of it's a relaxed line to just keep an eye on it, because again, this is an area that they don't believe is vulnerable.
But as this bombardment happens, like these things are just destroying the trees in these positions where these guys are coming in, and kind of under this artillery, as this artillery is firing off, because it's firing quite a distance, they're able to probably hit some of the areas like Bastogne, things like that, or they're moving in and getting closer, but the armor and the soldiers are moving in under this bombardment. And it doesn't take long for them to kind of push through this initial kind of tripwire line and start advancing over the course of this front. Now, there had been instances where the Allies were kind of tipped off to something might be happening. I think there was like a patrol that actually stumbled upon like an early advance of the Germans, and it actually reported back, and they just thought it was just kind of the Germans doing a regular like maneuver or something that wasn't huge. In fact, they thought
doing Nazi shit.
They thought on the other side of the Ardennes, because no one would try to attack through that, like the Allies, like, we're not going through this shit. They thought they were doing the same thing and having that be like a rest and recuperation place for like the guys that were serving the Nazis on the Western Front.
They also thought that buildups may potentially be headed towards Paris to try to take Paris again, which seems like it would be the last place that you would try to retake if you're trying to punch back.
Well, and they thought that because maybe that was symbolic or something like that, but it wouldn't have had any real strategic value.
No, and I'm sure Paris was probably patrolled by all three nations at that point in time.
Yes, I'm sure it was.
France was sitting in the back smoking cigarettes. The Brits were probably doing tea and crumpets, and we probably figured out how to make hot dogs. But other than that, we were ready to go if they came after Paris. Part of the Band of Brothers that Chris had me watch that was great, in another interview that I listened to, was after the shelling started happening, this area was kind of like the U.S. Club Med. Everybody would take leave there. They would rest. They would recuperate. They would send new troops there that weren't really battle ready and trained. Mm-hmm. This interview that I listened to, he was pulled up to the line after the shelling had happened, and he said, obviously, one of the first things that you do is you start digging your foxhole. But keep in mind the date is December 16th. Hitler's soothsayer of a weatherman says that you're going to be in for 2 weeks of bad weather that's going to cover you to stop U.S. air support. So the ground's frozen. So,
well, he didn't like make that happen. He just happened to be right about
just to
and
set.
It's also fucking December.
To set the stage with how cold and how bad this is. So he said that as he started to dig his foxhole and he started hitting frozen ground, what they adapted to was digging a skinny, shallow trench that they were able to lay in and that would cover their body. And then they would have to cover up with a blanket or something because the shrapnel that was hitting from the artillery shells and the bombs that were landing, even if it wasn't a direct hit, it was hitting trees and everything else. So all of the shrapnel and then just random tree being blown apart.
Some of them were burst and they would explode before hitting the ground. So then it's not that it's not so just kind of a ballistics thing. It's weird. If a grenade, like when a grenade is on the ground and explodes, it can really only disperse that shrapnel out and up. There's no way it can go down into the ground.
Yeah.
It's just putting it in the ground. These shells would actually burst, kind of like when the atomic bombs that were dropped. They didn't hit the ground and then explode. They exploded high up because then it was getting a much larger area. That's why these shell bursts, and they would just launch shrapnel in every single direction. So instead of being able to be on the ground and maybe you're behind a little hump and that could shield you from something that exploded on the ground, this is hitting you from above. So it's doing like, that's just goes to show you like, oh, we're going to make better ways to fucking, shred people.
Yeah. And so they would not be able to dig themselves down far enough to be protected from that. They still had to have a barrier just in case there was gunfire coming in to protect them that way. But they also had to worry about this stuff just raining down from the skies. You also have a massive amount of trench foot that's going on because your boots and your socks are constantly wet. And he talked about there was a time when he couldn't feel his feet anymore, so he had to just get, much like in Band of Brothers, when the medic tells the guy who can't feel his feet to keep moving and keep marching.
Yeah.
He said for fear that he would have an issue with his feet, he just never took his boots off because they can't swell up if you can't take them off, because he had heard of another guy in his platoon that took his boots off and they swole up and he couldn't get them back into the boots and he got pulled away from the front line because of it to go to the medic to go see the medic. So that's how badly, even though these guys were brand new, they were just thrown into the shit. These guys were recovering and recuperating from D-Day or from Market Garden or anything like that. They still want to fight. It doesn't matter where they are. They're down to go wherever.
So one thing that plays a huge factor in kind of trying to understand how crazy this was like Adam said, we're in December. The average temperature during this time frame was -7 Celsius or centigrade, however you want to say it. About 19 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit was the average temperature. Now, these guys being sent to this place to rest and everything like that, they weren't really needing to be equipped with a bunch of winter gear because they weren't really going to be doing a ton of stuff. If they did have winter gear, not everyone was going to be on that patrol line. They could swap jackets. They didn't need to have as much shit. The standard issue for a lot of these guys was essentially just like a cotton, thin type dress shirt jacket type thing. It was supposed to be lightweight and breathable because you were doing all this marching and you had landed sometime in June, July, or August. Just regular, I think, cotton pants. Pretty thin, not a lot of insulation. Leather boots, which I don't think were insulated, rubber-soled bottom, but not waterproof.
Good for quick tactical movements in dry, warmer areas.
And so these guys weren't equipped with a lot of winter gear. And like Adam was saying, you would be in these foxholes, you'd be digging them as deep as you could. And because of enemy being close to the lines, directly across from you, or the thought of like artillery bombardment, which could occur at any time, you weren't fucking leaving your foxhole for any reason. You were shitting and pissing in your foxhole. Water was just draining because of the snow melt and stuff getting moved around was draining into your foxhole. And so you're just kind of sitting in that stuff and it's going to soak through your boots. And trench foot was basically when your feet would get so wet and cold that the blood vessels would restrict in order to go ahead and keep the blood flow back because it couldn't keep that area warm. It was like a preservation thing. And so guys were getting pulled off line because they couldn't fucking like feel they were developing like huge sores and everything because the skin essentially was not getting blood. And so the tissue was dying. So it was a huge deal for these guys to be able to try to, stay warm. There were boot covers, I think they said, but they were in like extremely short supply.
Well, they were in short supply because our plan was to be home by Christmas. So like I said at the beginning of the episode, they weren't shipping out as many winter gear supplies as they should have been. They didn't have a lot of these overcoats that they wore. That interview that I listened to, the guy said that before he took off to France, he had bartered with one of the tank commanders and got his tank suit. So he at least had something that was insulated, because they're like wool lined tops and bottoms. I don't know why you would need that in a tank.
Maybe like flame retardant or something like that.
Yes, flame retardant I could see, but as far as being cold, I'm sure those things are hot as shit on the inside with the engine and.
Well, oh yeah, definitely. At the also some people were issued like a woolen coat, again short supply, but because you're sitting in a foxhole, everything is wet around you. It gets wet. Yeah, maybe it still keeps you a little dry, but what happens if you're outside walking? It's going to freeze and it's going to weigh you down. And they said it was like wearing a piece of concrete.
Yeah.
And you're trying to be able to be maneuverable and get in, move in firefights.
And you're sweating the entire time, which then freezes. Like there's no way to even think of staying warm. I was thinking about it, and this is how bad I would be at war. There's like, this episode brought a few things as to why I couldn't A, be at war, and B, command. They were talking about some of them had wool-lined underwear, and I thought about just how absolutely uncomfortable wool-lined underwear would be, and then I realized that they're in the middle of a war getting shot at, and there's bombs being dropped, and like, wool underwear is probably the least of your worries,
Your
right?
concern is keeping the underwear clean.
Yeah.
Not what it's made out of, yeah.
The other thing is, so many of these offensive movements, I could never be a general. I could never call any of this stuff, because none of these movements were ever done in the belief that there was going to be zero casualties.
That's exactly what my thought would be, is that I feel like I would see everything too much in the form of people.
Yes.
And not be able to disassociate and just see it in the form of numbers and forces and where we need to have these people. I would be looking for every alternative to be like, this is the plan we're going to do. That's going to have and I know that was always the key, was to have the least amount of casualties, but like being overly cautious and not like purposely sacrificing this group because it'll buy you time.
Yeah.
It would be very difficult for me to be able to just make that type of puppet master decision with other people's lives.
Just knowing that there was never a choice that you would make that wouldn't end up with somebody dying.
I guess the guys that are planning this have been doing it for so long, their entire career. So at this point, it's just, you got to be numb to it, maybe.
Well, and at one point in time, they were those guys that were being put at risk.
Yeah. So you think that would have given them a better understanding
True.
of it, but maybe it's just, that's why those people are in those positions.
Yeah.
So December 17th, I mean, they're kind of advancing across most of the fronts. Again, they're pretty much have surprise in this situation. It's kind of like how the Blitzkrieg was all over again. And they, are moving in tank units. They've captured several key towns. They've got control of this place. Is Malmedy in Belgium, right?
I believe so.
Yeah, because that's where it enters into, is Belgium, when you go on the other side of the Ardennes. And this is the place where it's known as, one of the things that the Battle of the Bulge is also known for, is the Malmedy Massacre. Do you want to go ahead and cover that?
They'd taken 113 troops hostage, basically, prisoners of war. But, and Chris and I kind of talked about this at break, because I look at this as more of like where did the aggression come from? And there's really no way that it doesn't start with the Germans and end with the Germans. Well, it starts with the Germans and then ends with the Russians. But you have these these German soldiers that move into Russia, and they're brutal. They're just committing mass atrocities. And then they run into the Russians, who are even worse than they are, but they're also being fueled by the mass atrocities that the Germans committed. So these German soldiers that are pulled off of the Eastern Front are coming into the Western Front, which, as Chris aptly pointed out, is probably one of the cleanest theaters of war as far as
war crimes, from what you kind of hear
war crimes.
about,
Yes, yeah. I didn't want to say the word massacre because we're talking about one right now, but war crimes for sure is the right term to use. And so these guys coming over, they round up these 113 troops. They line up all 113 troops. Luckily, some of them can scatter and get away in the forest, but they shoot and kill 84 of them just on the spot. And Chris, again, aptly pointed out, just like we were talking about before, this wasn't necessarily a military operation as it was the SS controlling an operation of the army.
Yeah, this was an SS group that had actually, like a Waffen SS division or unit that actually performed this. And again, the SS were the people that were like crazy about the fucking Nazi ideology. They were not special forces, because there was a lot more of them than that would have been, but basically they were the hardcores in belief of it, and they were going to do anything they could to win the war and to please, the fucking Fuhrer.
You kill and move on. There's you're not worried about raping the women in the village or anything like that.
We have a schedule to keep. We can't, mess with things like, treating prisoners of war along the lines that are in the fucking code of war or whatever you want to call it.
Where are we going to take these guys? We're on an offensive mission. We don't have lines to take these prisoners back. We have to work with what we have moving forward instead of trying to take prisoners.
One thing on December 16th that started as well, kind of part of this, is you're going to have different battles. You're going to have the Battle of the Bulge. And the Battle of the Bulge, the reason it got the name is when there were news reports coming back home, you had seen the news reports essentially where the lines were advancing. That would be some of the information. And as this operation was going through, what happened is one of the news articles or newspapers printed it and showed a big bulge where the Germans had actually pushed into the line. It was basically just a big dip that went from east to west. And so they coined it the Battle of the Bulge. That's what we know it mostly as, but militarily it's the Ardennes Offensive. Now, there was one place that it was the Battle of Eisenborn Ridge that took place between the 16th. So starting on the first day, it was one of the areas that was actually first hit, going all the way through the 26th. It was the only sector where the Germans didn't advance. And this was one of the sectors that were kind of being, where like the stronger German forces were actually being sent with like more armor and everything. It was a defensive position along a ridge line, but it was actually being manned by basically a new division. It was the 99th Infantry Division. And they were basically able to hold this area all the way until the 26th. They held it so much so. And the reason that it went through the 26th is because we'll get to what happens on the 25th. Mm-hmm. It's not that they lost it. Basically, what happened is the Germans just kind of went around it. They were like, fuck this, we're losing too many people and, armor and stuff. So we're just going to kind of move around this. During the battle, about 500 Americans were killed, many more wounded. The exact German losses aren't known, but basically through just like amount of like armor that they lost, it was like extremely substantial, the like tanks and everything that they took out. And again, these guys are on a 4-day schedule and they got 6 days of gas. Any delays in any of these places are just that maybe 5% chance that this thing had to succeed. It's just ticking down as this time goes by.
That's what I was about to say. We're 2 days into a 4-day schedule and they're not on schedule.
Yes.
And part of that is the resistance that's being put up, but part of it is you're trying to move very heavy machinery and weaponry through a forest.
Yeah.
Not to say that the roads were bad. I'm sure the roads were just fine. But at the same time, this place has already been torn up once during the Blitzkrieg. And it's not like they went through and had like massive projects to clean all this stuff up. They've made it usable again, but it's still not going to be smooth sailing.
Kind of getting back to the massacres, there were a few others that took place. The Malmedy is the most well-known one. There was one called the Wereth 11, and it was on December 17th. 11 black soldiers were tortured and shot. I'm not sure if they were part of the Red Ball Express or I think they were transport drivers. This battle is the first instance in World War II of service integration. Mm-hmm. Units used to be kept segregated. You would have like certain units, again, like i.e. Tuskegee Airmen. You had Sherman had essentially a group called the Black Panthers, who were like a tank unit of all black guys. And then you had the guys that were like driving transports and everything. Because of how desperate it got for the Allies to defend this area, they were just sending everybody they could. And so this was essentially the first time that these units were integrated in all of World War II.
Took long enough.
Yeah, no kidding. So as part of this, these guys were making this stand on the ridge, kind of holding them up and everything. Sorry, getting back to the map. There's another massacre. Jesus. I keep thinking it's the last one. Okay. To be fair, it also occurred on the other side as well.
Yeah.
So it's the Chenogne, Chenogne. I don't know, because Bastogne, Chenogne.
Sounds right.
The Chenogne massacre, when American troops executed 60 German POWs.
This was also after the Malmedy massacre, and I believe it had gotten around to the front that this is what the Germans do, so we need to respond in kind.
I understand your point. What I'm saying is that you got to fucking take your licks too when you do this shit.
Oh, yeah.
If you're supposed to be the ones that are better than this and you're doing the same things they are, it doesn't make you better. But it does go to also show what state and how heightened it was at that point, especially during this battle when basically the Americans get fucking socked right in the teeth in this surprise attack, and they're just basically scrambling for any sense of their lives.
Yeah. Yeah, it just kicks in. That's where I have such a tough time with war, is I know that you always want to be better, but I would have a hard time if I was in another one of those battalions and heard what they did at Malmedy and not be like, all right.
And these guys that are stationed here, they're not being ordered to like pull back and retreat. They are, pulling back from positions as they have to when, they pretty much don't have any other choice. But it's not just like the Germans are attacking fucking run. They're being given orders to basically delay the Germans for as much time as they can, because again, you're not like surrounded at this point. You have allied forces that are, back behind you in different towns and cities. And so you're trying to rush and mobilize anyone you can to get up there, but you need time to do that. What this also does by buying time is those, that sweet, sweet gasoline that Hitler needs. These fuel depots, you're giving them time to either reroute all of that stuff, move all of those supplies back further down the line, or simply destroy them. So all of this stuff that Hitler's counting on to be there when they go in, it ain't going to be there because they're already behind schedule. And these, undermanned, underprepared soldiers are putting up this fucking fight. Did you read about Operation Grief?
Is that the spies?
Yes.
What's his name? Stanecki?
Otto Sikorsky?
Sikorsky.
So this guy's famous for something other than the Battle of the Bulge. And it's actually going to be something we get into a little bit deeper here in an upcoming episode. But it is the guy that was basically in charge of the mission to rescue Mussolini.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yep. So after he does this, his reward is he's sent out here to the Battle of the Bulge to actually run this mission called Operation Grief. And he basically got together a bunch of English-speaking German soldiers and a whole bunch of, American uniforms because soldiers had been killed. Supplies had been left. So you also have like them driving American Jeeps. And their job was to basically drive behind and get in through American lines, not to do like assassinations or anything like that, but to basically try to cause chaos. So what they were doing is they were cutting communication lines. They were swapping around street signs and directional signs for different villages and where to go to reach this. They were trying to like sabotage anywhere they could. They were also trying to get their hands on some of these supply depots as well. Now, it got to the point where they started getting caught, and this almost caused more chaos with them catching them than I think they could have actually probably caused on their own, because all of a sudden this report goes out all throughout the area, word's getting around that there are German soldiers disguised as Americans. So you have instances at roadblocks, checkpoints, anytime two units that aren't familiar with each other are interacting, or someone sees another soldier that's maybe walking down the line or doing a check and doesn't recognize them, that's a threat to now be a German soldier. And so they came up with these tests that they would actually do, testing them on, baseball knowledge back in the States or American pop culture type shit. And it got so bad at certain points. Montgomery's tires got shot out of his Jeep. Apparently he was at a checkpoint. He was trying to move through and they shot the tires out of his Jeep.
Good.
Omar Bradley was actually detained for a little bit because they were questioning him, and they're like, "What's the capital of Illinois?" And he's like, "Springfield," and they're like, "It's Chicago." And so they thought for a second,
still wrong.
And no, I think Springfield isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
But for them to say wrong in Chicago,
Yeah, exactly. And he's sitting there being like, "No, it's Springfield." He's like, "I'm also like, who's going to dress as like a general? Like, and you've also heard of Brad, like, look, it says Bradley on my thing here."
Kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
There's not two of me walking around. At the same time, though, is that not go to show you that what they did during the Ghost Army time in Operation Fortitude, yes, we might have had like multiple generals in different areas dressed up in uniform together. Like, does that theory ever?
No, because I don't think Operation Fortitude, no one knew anything about that until after the war. Especially common soldiers wouldn't have known anything about that. I just think there was such a heightened level of fear because you're already on high alert and so fucking like wound tight in that situation. First of all, you're freezing your fucking ass off. You probably don't have it. You definitely don't have enough food or supplies. At certain points, they would get down to like one round a man before they finally got resupplied. It got bad enough to where with like artillery guns, they were like, you cannot fire more than 10 shells a day out of each of these guns.
Make them count.
And
but what happens if you're a literary? What happens if you like reading books and you think that, or somebody thinks you're a German and they walk up and ask you what Ted Williams averaged at bat 3 years ago? Like,
you would probably,
you're not gonna know.
No, but I'm sure that if you knew enough other, like, that's just the example they give because it also does make it seem kind of cool that they were like doing baseball knowledge.
Well, and Ted Williams was over there, so
yeah, I'm sure they also had different questions. He's like, I'm actually a nerd, and he's like, okay, let me ask you a bunch of other questions.
These guys didn't know that Chicago wasn't the capital of Illinois.
That's true. Holy shit. Yeah, that's true. God, I wouldn't even. Can you imagine being that soldier after the guy's like, that's actually General Bradley. He's like, and the capital is actually Springfield.
You know that you're being put on the train duty for the next 6 months if you question
Shouldn't
Bradley.
you be at the front?
Yeah. Yeah. Everybody else has enough bullets. I found one for you.
So as the Germans are, making this push, they're starting to approach the town of Bastogne. And the town of Bastogne was extremely strategically important because there were 11 roads that actually kind of intersected either in or around Bastogne. Basically, what this allowed you to do was pretty much spiderweb out your forces very quickly to all of these other areas. So you have the Germans essentially moving across these narrow roads. It's taking them longer, all of that stuff. If they can get to this point where they control Bastogne, they can spread out in pretty much any direction in Northern Europe, especially being able to control those roads and cut off any type of Allied counterattack or reinforcements trying to stop them from getting to Antwerp. So this town was very important that they actually capture this. Well, the Americans are also aware of the strategic importance of this town, so they're scrambling to do anything and everything they can to try to reinforce this place. They don't have a ton of resources available that are close enough to get in there, but one they are able to kind of pull together is the 101st Airborne. They were, I think, about like 100, a little over 100 miles away when they heard of the attack, through the Ardennes. And so they had to basically just immediately get all their shit together. I think when you're also in kind of like a staging area like that, they actually wanted to control, like if you weren't going to be sent out on missions or you're resting, I think you had to check in your weapons. Because they did say there were instances when guys were being sent out, they're like, we didn't even have time to get our weapons checked back out. And that makes sense that you're not going to want a bunch of soldiers that are, able to probably like drink a little bit and everything to have access to their guns.
Yeah, you don't want that in a whorehouse. That's not going to...
Especially with how fucking stressed out these guys are. But so these guys are like, hey, you're heading for Bastogne. You need to hold off the Germans. And they're basically sent there between the 19th and then they fully arrive. All of them arrive on the 20th. Mostly lacking winter clothing, low ammunition, low supplies. They're an airborne unit, which basically the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, are the guys that were the Easy Company band of brothers were part of. They were the company that had dropped in, or the division that had dropped in to Normandy on D-Day. I think they also participated in Operation Market Garden. So these guys were meant to be like shock troops. Drop you in, you're supposed to be there for maybe like a week fighting, and then you're going to go ahead and create a line so all of the rest of our forces can move up, and then we pull you off the front. Well, these guys are now walking into this in which they're not really prepared for. And as they're moving in, and these other soldiers and these reinforcements that they're trying to move in, they're moving in trucks, they're moving in on foot, and they're seeing people that have been pushed back by the German advance, units that are trying to get pulled back even further. And these guys are just beat to shit. And so they're like, okay, well, give us whatever you have on you. Like, you're not going to be needing it. And so they're trying to take anything they can off these guys, supplies, blankets, if someone will trade a winter jacket, ammunition, any round they can get, and march themselves into Bastogne. And they're deployed, I want to say in like a 10-mile radius. So like 10 miles out is where they're kind of creating the line of, the perimeter around Bastogne to basically defend this area.
Well, and at the same time, it's an airborne unit. We've talked about the strategic importance of having air superiority or anything like that. This window for this whole Ardennes offensive was supposed to be in this 2 weeks of bad weather. So just because you couldn't launch a full-scale attack didn't mean that there weren't Allied planes flying in the area. So they're still able to move, but at the same time, they're not able to go on the offensive.
No,
so,
and the Germans, they're not flying either, but you're pretty likely, if you're flying and you're trying to do bombing, you really can't do that because you have to fly high enough to basically avoid all the anti-aircraft fire that you can. And also, if you're bombing, they probably can have their fighters up as well. But the other big thing is not so much the air cover from like a combat perspective, but what about supplies?
Yeah.
You can't get supplies in there. If you end up getting cut off or getting encircled, which that's exactly what's going to happen in Bastogne, there's not a way with this weather and this fog, still basically, clouding up the sky, you're not able to have them drop anything accurately. I think they did try to do a couple drops, but they found that they ended up dropping stuff to the Germans as often as they dropped it to the Allies.
Well, that just goes to show kind of on both sides, if you can't have kind of your full arsenal, you have to make adjustments. The Germans knew that they were going to have to win this one on the ground. If they were going to do it, this wasn't going to be the Luftwaffe gaining air superiority again and protecting their troops. They had to do it on the ground. Another thing that they had tried to use over there was the V program rockets. So the V1 and V2 that they were bombing up against Great Britain. They were bringing them from a mass bombing campaign into an area where they're just trying to fire on these installments.
Well, and they were bombing since I want to say 10 hours after the first assault for the Battle of the Bulge, the first initial assault. They did a V2 assault on Antwerp because they were trying to also hit the port and everything. Kills 500, and it was one rocket that hit a theater, killed 567 people, which was the largest death toll by a V2 rocket of the war.
Which, thankfully, it's because the V2s were very inaccurate. Mm-hmm. So, this hit me. This was a high thought that hit me. Otto
Skorzeny or Scorsese?
No. WVB, Werner von Braun.
Oh, yeah.
His big rocket that he launched was the Saturn V, right?
Yeah.
And they used Roman numerals?
Yeah.
And it's a V?
Yeah.
Was any of that an ode to the
No,
V1
because I think
and V2
the V
rockets?
stood for something different. I think it had a name. It wasn't like the 5.2.
Okay.
Yeah. I get where you're looking there. You asked a question about the Allies using horses.
Yeah.
So just to show you on the German side what they were trying to cobble together for this, 50,000 horses were used by the Germans during this operation. 50,000. Can you fathom seeing 50,000 horses?
So they said at the time when they were doing testing for, just to show you how tight this fuel crisis was, when they were doing testing on like new planes that they were trying to develop, they had actually bailed from having the kind of like land tugboat. I'm sure you know the term for that, to pull the jets out onto the runways.
Yeah.
They abandoned that to use horses so they wouldn't use fuel in them to pull them out. So that's how close they were to running out of fuel, was even when they were testing new shit back at home, like, we can't spare the fuel. You can only be up in this thing for 5 minutes because that's all you got.
Scaring the shit out of these fucking horses. So as the Germans are pushing, they get to Bastogne, I think, like in 4 days. So by the time they're supposed to have secured Antwerp, they're just now getting to Bastogne. And basically these, the Allied troops, the airborne, and the guys that are already there are fucking digging in. And I mean, they're doing everything they can. They have some tanks, they have some artillery, but they're using that to try to protect, and hold them kind of back in the town. They don't want to lose those, on the front line after the initial assault. They're also taking like anti-aircraft guns. They're the ones with like the 4 machine guns that are on them. They were taking those and digging them down into the ground to where they could be used against infantry. So you're basically taking something you're trying to use against aircraft and you're pointing it level and you're going to use it against soldiers.
Kim Jong-un style.
Yeah. I mean, they're doing anything they possibly can. Once Bastogne gets encircled, and I think it ends up being encircled on the 21st. The siege essentially takes place between the 20th and the 26th. And after they get surrounded, I'm not sure which guy it was. I don't know if it was McAuliffe, because he comes in a little bit later. But one of the guys was talking about, he's like, so the Germans have got us surrounded. He's like, those poor bastards. And so the Germans, once they get them encircled, Siege of Bastogne is happening. They're not stopping there. The Germans continue to advance and kind of expand their pocket. At the maximum amount of the bulge, the size of it, was 50 miles wide and 70 miles deep. So to try to put that into some perspective, it wasn't just like this bulge that was around this little town. Like, this town was pretty much kind of in the middle of this and completely surrounded and cut off.
We're not math professors. You said 50 miles wide and 70 miles deep. So the entire bulge was 3,500 square miles.
If you say so. Sounds good to me. That's a huge...
Yeah, that's a pretty big bulge.
Yes, that's a huge amount of territory. During this time, on the 19th, after, the 101st Airborne had been sent there, Ike actually has like a meeting, and they're wanting to go ahead and get this planned. And Eisenhower is kind of looking at this, and everyone's freaking out. Of course, they weren't expecting this offensive, and Ike just calmly looks at everyone. He's like, "Okay, this is an opportunity." He's like, "Do you know how hard it is? We all know how hard it is to try to destroy this stuff when they're in defensive positions and they're hiding and everything." He's like, "They're out on open ground." He's like, "Let's view this as an opportunity. This is good news that this is happening," because in his head, he's like, if we turn this thing around, which I know we can, regardless of how long it takes, how much of their strength are we going to take out of the picture by doing this?
All we need's a clear day.
Yep, we need a clear day. The weather's got to break, but at the same time, he's like, but we want to try to hold what we have now.
Yeah.
What do we have to plan? And Montgomery's like, I can be down there to, relieve them and support them in 2 weeks. And Patton, he looks over at Patton. He's like, what can you do? And he's like, 2 days. And he's like, honestly, don't mess around. How quickly can you be up there to try to put pressure to relieve them and get to Bastogne? He's like, 2 days. He's like, as soon as this, he's like, I've had contingency plans for all of this drawn up. He's like, I kind of suspected. He was down a little bit further south on the line and basically had his cabinet, the guys that were reporting to Patton, draw up a bunch of these contingency plans for pretty much any and all scenarios. He's like, if this happened, I already have a group that can turn and pivot, and we can have, an armored division or armored troops up there in 2 days. So Eisenhower looks at him. He's like, fucking do it.
Why was Patton so confident in the 2 days mark, though. Because he had already sent.
That's right. Because he'd heard about the attack because, of course, he's going to get that information on the 16th. They're meeting on the 19th. And he basically had already started the gears in motion and they were already moving in that direction.
Yeah,
he hadn't taken his full forces because they were also holding a line against a German line. He only pulled a certain number of that, but what he felt he needed to be able to essentially kind of break through their advance.
Yeah, he can have presence there in 2 days because they started walking, or they started heading that direction 3 days ago.
Yeah.
So he needed 5 days, but he just happened to tell them of the plan in 2 days.
Well, and you got to imagine that as soon as he said that, Montgomery's just like, he's like, fuck off. He's like, you can't do that. Well, it ends up not being 2 days. And the reason it's not 2 days is not because it couldn't have been done. It's because part of the advance ends up getting into an area where they're able to kind of slow down Patton. And he's having to do some fighting on his way there. Again, these tank columns can travel much easier across roads because they're not having to worry about anything in the dead of winter, any melt, muddy fields, getting their tanks stuck. And so all these Germans have to do when they're trying to move these, tanks in fast and these soldiers in fast is they just kind of have to gum up the road network. And so I believe it ends up taking Patton a few extra days to actually reach the German lines.
But boy, when he does, when the entire Fourth Army gets there, they came off of a 19-hour march. 19 straight hours that they had marched up there and just immediately went to battle.
Yeah.
Because they had to relieve this pocket. I didn't realize pocket is kind of turned into theater for me because there's a lot of pockets in World War II. And it's just kind of an interesting phrase. Like you had the pocket during Stalingrad. Mm-hmm. There's always these pockets because everybody seems to get themselves in a pickle and get surrounded.
What's funny is when they were talking in that meeting and they were trying to find out, devise a plan, and Patton's like, yeah, I can be there in 2 days. He also was like, what we should do? We should just try to let them make a run all the way to Paris because then they could just make a narrow corridor. And he's like, we'll just sweep in behind them and trap the entire army. We'll give them area if they want to move in. Paris is nothing because that's where they thought maybe they were going to go. And he's like, it's nothing. We can just then sweep in behind them and cut off most of their forces.
Create another pocket.
Uh-huh.
Along with that, they get the break of all breaks, December 25th. It turns out that Hitler's meteorologist wasn't as accurate as he said because the 16th and the 25th are only 11 days apart.
50%. Oh, no, actually, 16th to the 25th? I mean, that's pretty close.
Hitler wanted them to do this in 4 days.
I realize that, but it's not the meteorologist's fault. It's already the 25th.
No, but that's 3 days short of the window that he gave.
Yeah.
That's a lot of time. That's almost enough time for Hitler's plan to be taken. But when that weather breaks, everything changes. And this is, it's almost like there was divine intervention for that weather to break because it's still cold as hell on the ground, but you can start launching air support. And when you can start launching air support, you can start picking these things off. One of the podcasts that I was listening to, the expert was talking about how because of the weather events that had happened when the Allied forces finally got their planes up, it was the easiest thing in the world because all of the tank tracks, even if as soon as they realized the weather was going to break, they would pull the tanks off into forests, anywhere like that to try to hide and get them under cover. But you have all of these fresh tank tracks in the snow that lead you directly to where they are.
Giant just strips of mud just standing starkly against the white of the snow, just leading into little groups of trees. And they're just so just bomb the fucking group of trees.
Yep.
So not only does this allow them to start actually taking out these, the armor and these troop positions, but all of a sudden this group of, I think they said it was at 200 C-47s fly over Bastogne and just start dropping supplies. Most of the first, or for most, if not all of the first drop that they did was all ammunition.
Yeah,
Which I can see from a command standpoint, you're like, they need to be able to fight. But at the same time, like 75% ammunition, maybe 25% food. Like, come on. Like, these guys have not been eating. Like, you have to be able to pick up the fucking rifle to fire it.
You're hungry, but the Germans are also hungry. You might as well feed them lead before you feed them before you feed yourself.
No, I'm fucking hungry. Feed me and I'll still shoot.
You don't want to be sitting there eating a sandwich.
This is why you're not going to be a military.
In one hand.
Also, during this time, there's no access to, like, you know, during the Siege of Bastogne, when guys are still getting wounded and fucking killed, there's no, like, surgeons. They weren't able to get those people in. They had to get just the people that could fight in there. And so there was a point when they actually towed a glider with, I think it was like 5 or 6 battlefield surgeons into Bastogne for them to start, like, fucking operating and saving these guys' lives. Which is fucking crazy, because they're telling you, hey, you're going into an area that's completely surrounded, and we can't guarantee that it's going to get broken anytime sooner. They're not going to break through. You know that, right? And they're just like, fuck it, we're going in there.
How historically accurate in the Band of Brothers was it that everybody had morphine in their packs?
I believe that's fairly accurate. The reason you had it in there is because instead of the medic having to carry around an entire thing of morphine, enough for everybody if they get injured, what if he gets hit and his pack gets destroyed? All the morphine's gone. If everyone has their own little aid kit, that I think it came, they, you know, jumped with it in Normandy, and I don't know if they re-upped it on different missions, but it would come with like bandages, morphine, and it probably came with a couple other things, maybe some like purification tablets for water or something.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
That morphine, I mean, that was there essentially for if you got hit to try to save your life by taking the pain. And sure, I'm sure we're going to have to dig into that, because I'm sure there were some people that were fucking stealing that from people and getting hooked on it, trying to take yourself out of that situation.
This reason number 11 why I'd be a bad soldier. My morphine would be gone probably an hour after I got off the truck.
I was going to say, you would have been in the plane going over the English Channel, and the guy would have looked over and you would have been just sticking it in your leg and squeezing that little tube.
Got to get psyched, man. I got to get ready.
Well, during this time as well, before Patton's able to get there and before the weather actually clears, is the commander of the Germans, Commander Lutwitz, sends a communication to the Allied commander, the American commander in Bastogne, and basically is like, we're requesting your honorable surrender of the city. We demand your response in, like, I think it was like 3 hours. And so it was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe.
I don't like this guy.
He ends up, you know, reading the surrender request, and basically all he can think to say is nuts. Like, the guy's nuts. He's crazy. And he's like, I don't know how to respond to this. And his staff is just like, just respond like that. Just put nuts. And he's like, all right. So he literally responds back to the German commander with just nuts. And then the like interpreter has to interpret what he's saying. And they end up interpreting it like it even being like a lot more of a slight than it was like just supposed to be.
Yeah. Well, there were a couple different theories as to why he said it. One of them was that he was a very prim and proper and clean guy, and nuts was like the most angry thing that he could think of at the time. Another one was that they maybe toned down what he said and just wrote nuts. But if somebody sends you that, and you know who you are, and you know what your army is capable of, and you know what is following and coming their direction, it's the perfect time to just write the most disgusting things back to him.
Yeah.
Just suck
I was trying to
my
think
dick.
in my head over the last couple of days what I would have responded back with.
Your funeral is what it would be, I think.
So, I mean, things got, before this resupply happened, and when this guy actually responded with nuts, they weren't exactly in great shape.
No.
They were just, they knew that they were going to hold the line, and they were going to hold it long enough for, you know, additional troops to end up getting there to try to relieve them.
Maybe he was requesting nuts.
Maybe.
Instead of surrender, he wanted nuts for his guys.
Maybe. I watched a couple of veteran interviews about it, and they were talking. I think one of them was an officer, like a sergeant, and he was like, we got lucky in the way they attacked the lines as well, because they would only attack us with infantry and one tank at a time. And we didn't really have anything that close up to the line. Like back in the city, they had some tanks, but not up like at the line. He's like, we didn't really have anything that could take on a tank. Our only hope was to hit it in the tracks with our bazookas and try to disable the thing. And then at that point, because, the field of vision with a tank, the reason why it's not just a tank that's sent out, it has to be sent out with troops, is because the field of vision, once that tank is closed, is just that little slit that the driver's looking through. No field of vision to the side. He can basically just see what's in front of him. And the guy with the little periscope and aiming thing is looking around to see what he's going to aim at.
And he's just yelling like 1 o'clock.
Yeah, or degrees or whatnot. So infantry could flank these things and hit it from the side. The reason you would have, or enemy infantry you would have infantry with the tank because they were to protect the tank's blind spots. But he was talking about, he's like, we got lucky they did that because at any point, had they sent in 2 tanks, that's all it would have taken and the line would have collapsed. He's like, but they never did. And then because of that, we could hit the tank from 2 sides and try to disable it. If we had to do that with 2 tanks, he's like, we wouldn't have been able to do it. We got lucky that they were just that clueless about it.
Man, that's a close call.
Yeah, no shit.
Once Patton's boys get there, the liberation of Bastogne kind of seems to start rolling. Within 24 hours, on December 27th, the Allied forces had broken the German lines that were surrounding Bastogne. There were forces pushing from the north and south, and this was the halt of kind of the 11-day German advance and kind of the first start to contain the Bulge.
And when this happened, news reports are going on, back in the States and everything about this, and they're discussing the battled bastards of Bastogne. This, 101st Airborne and all these other troops that are defending Bastogne and holding the line. And when Patton ends up getting there and, there's all of this talk about like Patton rescuing the 101st, not a single member of the 101st has ever said that they needed to be rescued. In fact, they say the opposite. They're like, we didn't need Patton to rescue us. They're like, we would have been just fine. And to me, that's fucking badass.
Yeah, it's hindsight.
No, it is. I get it is hindsight, but what was made of that was that Patton was the hero of that.
Yeah.
Patton got the overview of the shine because he charged in there in the tanks and everything, and he relieved it. He helped to kind of start that initial point of when the Bulge started getting pushed back to the original line. And you got to imagine those guys have been there since the fucking 17th or what was it, the 19th or the 20th, fighting in freezing cold, holding back this line. And all of a sudden he swings and he's like, oh, you've been rescued. He's like, fuck you. Leave the tanks, get the fuck out.
Still, this one single episode and just kind of knowing the name Patton beforehand has led me to know that we're going to have to do a Patton episode in the future because he seems wildly interesting. And just this push that they make has to completely shatter the Germans because this was their whole, they had to get Bastogne. Bastogne was supposed to be like day 2 and we're on day 11 and they're losing it.
And units are starting to run out of fuel and everything at this point. No one has achieved their objective. No one's got to the Meuse River. And also, along the Meuse River, because it was further back behind the lines, they've got those bridges completely defended. They've been able, because that's the first thing that they're going to do. They're going to move some guys forward, but they're going to keep some guys at those bridges.
Well, and the general said, too, that if they got to the Meuse River, they would consider it successful because that was what they believed that they could possibly do. Getting all the way to Antwerp
and taking Antwerp
wasn't their main objective.
But what did they even what are they judging success on? What would that have gained them?
Nothing.
They just would have pushed back the line. They still would have been getting supplies from Antwerp. Maybe they thought they could then use that as a staging ground for another attack.
I think it was a moral victory. Okay. I think getting to the river was just a moral victory.
That's all they had at this point.
Making chicken salad out of chicken shit, I think, is what they were thinking. Do you have anything before January 1st?
Nope.
For that, I think you answered it earlier. The spies that had the U.S. uniforms, I was erring on the side of hope and thinking, did they make knockoff uniforms back in Germany, or were these uniforms that they were pulling off of guys that they killed?
Probably mostly pulling off guys that they killed. Also, if they're running over supply depots and they're having to, leave, some people are leaving their uniforms or leaving their extra uniforms.
Okay.
Maybe, so they could have gotten them that way. So I see what you mean. Like, are they patched holes and do they have like stains on them?
Like,
I think they were a little bit cleaner than that.
So it wouldn't be weird if somebody was like walking through camp and they had a bullet hole and a blood stain right below it. Would that be
very odd? It would be odd.
You think?
So Otto Skorzeny, I think we've pronounced his name like 3 different ways, but that's the guy that ended up running this. The guys that were caught, technically they were spies, and so they were executed.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the risk of espionage.
Yep.
Big rewards, big punishments. They had a guy in there. His name was Otto Struhler. He was a ballet dancer. And I don't know if he was identified through his ballet work, but when he was found, he was just shot on sight.
Yeah.
Like there wasn't...
Someone just hated the ballet.
Either that or they ask him Ted Williams' batting average, and he's like, is Ted Williams a dancer? And they're like, no, he's German. Get him. January 1st. Kind of something that gets lost in autumn mist.
Watch on the Rhine, all that good stuff.
Yeah, all this was that there were other operations that were going on kind of within the operation. This was like the battle, Inception.
Like Battle of the Bulge, but then there's battles of this, battles, Bastogne.
One of them that happened on January 1st was Operation Bodenplate.
Base plate. Bodenplate is how you say it in German.
And the Luftwaffe had some success. They had open skies. They didn't have the air superiority, but they had the art of surprise. They successfully bombed Allied airfields, destroyed several grounded planes that were out on the airstrip. That seems like a great win. 2 problems. The Allies had replaced all of the bombed out planes within a week, so you didn't gain anything. And B, you didn't do what you needed to do to make the airfields not run. You didn't kill the human capital that made the whole operation go.
Yeah, so the plan was essentially this huge, like the same way that, the Ardennes Offensive was this huge push with infantry and with armor and everything. Base plate was going to be the operation where the Luftwaffe, socked it to the Allied Air Force. And their main goal was to go after like the concrete airport airstrips, because those were the ones that they could use a lot more frequently, larger planes. They were told to go after hangars and barracks because to knock out the pilots and to also knock out repair facilities. And I mean, it was relatively successful. The Allies lost 465 planes during this. The Germans only lost 277. But at the same time, you're bombing behind the lines. And when you get shot down, it's not like if the Allies are losing, and they lost a lot of planes probably on the ground as well, but those troops or those pilots jump out, they're in friendly territory. The Germans jump out, not in friendly territory. Not only that, but the pilots that were actually pulled up for this, some of them, they pulled from instructors at like the Luftwaffe schools.
Yeah.
So some of these guys that were lost were the guys that were essentially supposed to be teaching the next people to come up, and now you don't have that resource anymore. So even though material-wise, the Allies lost more, it could just be replaced much easier, and the pilots were usually still alive, where every, a high percentage of those 277 that went down probably either, crashed and died or were taken prisoner.
Well, and in typical fashion, the way that they would do it, kind of, I'm going to go out on a war limb here, and we're going to see if I can get this right just based off of memory. Much like Pearl Harbor, they sent out this attack in 2 waves.
I'm not sure specifically.
But that's what they did.
Okay.
Is that 2 waves, Pearl Harbor?
Yes, it was 2 waves. I think I know where you're getting at with this. Was it the ultimatum that they gave to the pilots?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
You could explain the ultimatum, but after they hit this first wave, you didn't knock everybody out of commission. So you're going to get a chase that goes on in the sky, And by the time your second wave gets up into the air, there's already Allied planes in the air.
They're flying into the hornet's nest. The first one poked the hornet's nest, didn't kill all the hornets. The second ones are flying in, and they were told essentially by their commanders with the Luftwaffe that if you didn't hit something on your flight, you were going to jump right back in your plane and you were going to fly back until you got it like a successful kill on a plane or you bombed like an airfield. And going back the second time, like Adam just said, they were ready for you. All of the remaining planes were flying, combat air patrols and just waiting. So it was pretty much that if you didn't hit anything the first time, you weren't coming back home.
Well, and I'm sure you have something on this, so I'm confident throwing it out. Hitler had his finger in the pie of the Luftwaffe that may have caused them some issues because they had bomber jets?
They had fighter and bomber jets. So they had developed, basically because if you have a jet engine, you can apply it to either or. If you're looking at like a bomber, they just have more, possibly a larger engine than the fighters actually have. So if you can develop a jet engine, you can then make it larger or smaller. And the Germans, technological wise, were leading the war.
They had the Benz engines.
Yes, exactly. Well, and at the same time, they're now developing jet technology, which isn't something that was available for the Allies. It may have been being developed, but the Germans actually put it into practical use. They created a jet fighter, which I want to believe is the Messerschmitt 262. I'm probably wrong on that. But they wanted, that was going to be strictly a fighter. Then they developed essentially a jet bomber, and the jet bomber was faster than any of the fighters that the Allies had, so they wouldn't even be able to catch these things to even shoot them down. Well, Hitler started meddling in because he wanted his dick in every little fucking piece of the pie, and he starts telling him, no, we need to make it a fighter bomber. And that may seem like a minor distinction, but when you also have to be a bomber, you have to lose characteristics that make you a successful fighter plane in order to be successful or semi-successful as a bomber. What this also does is you already have this fighter plane developed and you have this guy coming in. He's like, I wanted to carry the bombs. And all of a sudden, you're back to the drawing board to design a stronger airframe, a release system for bombs. So this thing that you could have put into production and had up in the air trying to win you this war is now back on the drawing table, and you're trying to figure out how to fucking fulfill this psychopath's little request that it carries things that go boom.
I don't know if his theory was necessarily wrong, because if they wanted to try to bomb airfields, that sounds like it would be a pretty good plan. But the fact that they set them back so many weeks and they can't move this offensive back, you're just out of commission both directions. You don't have what they suggested, and you don't have what you suggested because you made such radical changes that there's just none out there.
Yeah.
I think they said there were a couple of the jet bombers or fighter jets maybe that they had created beforehand.
There was one model that actually got produced and actually flew in some combat missions.
But they only used it for like security forces.
They kept them because they had so few of them. Yes, they kept them essentially in like and around for like protecting Berlin and like strategic targets in Germany.
Well, and that's the other stretch too. You have a Luftwaffe. We keep going off on these side tangents, but hopefully they're interesting. The Luftwaffe just took massive losses a couple years ago in Stalingrad, like insurmountable losses.
Yeah, and it's because you're sitting there where it's fucking frozen and everything, and you're trying to maintain all this equipment. It was so cold that they were having to start the engines of like a lot of these vehicles every like half hour to hour to keep the motor oil from congealing. That's how fucking cold it got. And so if you're trying to operate planes where it's even colder once you're up in the air, and they're having to sit on the ground for extended periods of time, that's a lot of fucking upkeep.
So that's going to take a chunk out of your air attack. You also now have to keep the Luftwaffe back at home in Berlin because we're taking shots and raiding.
Yeah, because our bombers are going to be, if we keep taking territory, we're going to be able to hit Berlin pretty quickly.
So your Luftwaffe that you have for base plate is fraction of what it should be because you have to protect at home too.
Well, and during this time when it started looking bad, and it was looking bad early for Germany, but a little bit, during this kind of time frame we're talking about, Germany lowered the volunteer age of the military to 16, and it raised the age of conscription up to 60. And so for this operation, they were creating these things called Volksgrenadiers, and they were basically like an economically friendly infantry. They didn't have to be as well equipped or anything like that. They were basically just like bodies to fill the uniforms and to hold the rifle.
Weren't they trying to train the Hitler Youth to fly planes or something like that?
Yeah, they were training them to fucking do all that shit.
Like 16-year-old in a plane? That seems probably pretty nuts. Like a bad move.
The fact that you're being like, hey, we're going to let these, you're like, what are you doing to the survivability of like your people and your country
Future
at that
generations,
point?
yeah. Yeah, there's going to be a major gap in births for a very long time because 16-year-olds are getting shot down in planes.
And in the very beginning, there were about a total of like 80,000 U.S. troops in the Ardennes. Now, that sounds like a lot, but if you're spreading those troops over the course of like an 80-mile front, they're having to kind of be distributed over that. And the German offensive is only being hit really strongly at certain areas. You're not going to have that many guys just concentrated there. And again, they don't have like a ton of these like anti-tank weapons, and they're not these, anti-tank divisions. By the time that it was Christmas, they had 500,000 Allied troops in the Ardennes. And that included, because they weren't just like, oh, we can only send American troops in there. It was at that point, it was just like everybody get the fuck in there. Send the people in there that you can spare.
By the end of the war, I believe it was 1 million Allied troops that had served in the Ardennes.
Moving through, or at least like patrolling it or like guarding it and stuff. At that point, I'm sure the guard was a little bit more.
That's a lot. That's a lot of troops in there.
And, from the 26th on, when the skies cleared and they were able to go ahead and bring kind of their air might to bear, it was just at that point like just a pushback of that Bulge. And as Patton had, broken through to Bastogne, they'd kind of broken that area, and they just continued to push the German forces back, leaving a ton of equipment again, because you only had enough gas for 6 days. You're not going to have enough gas to go the additional time that you've already gone and then turn around and get all that shit back. So not only did they lose, a shit ton of men, but they're also leaving all of this material there, which at this point as well, they're now not able to keep up with the manufacturing on it.
Well, as that's happening, you're seeing sort of the front shrink because the Brits get involved. The 6th Airborne and the 53rd Infantry move towards this western tip of the German advance. They thwart that advance. January 3rd, you have these 3 German panzer divisions that have to withdraw from their part of the front lines and move towards the interior of the Bulge, because the Bulge is where they've had the most success. So they're kind of almost turning the Bulge into a pocket because they're crumbling on either side.
They're desperate to defend that swath that they've actually been able to take. They're trying to get something out of nothing.
Mm-hmm. And you think that you would want support from the homeland.
Oh,
that
yeah, definitely.
You maybe want Hitler to do something. January 7th and 8th, Hitler withdraws all the northern troops in the Ardennes to avoid being cut off because he didn't want to get pocketed.
Well, like 4 days before that, he'd actually stopped the supply chains and the reinforcements, basically as he saw the writing on the wall, and the generals are like, fucking finally you see it. Start pulling people back. He's like, I will get around to it.
What are you doing cutting off the supply chains, though?
Yeah,
there's still people at the front.
Yeah, maybe wait till the 7th or the 8th before you cut off the supply chains.
Just a crazy move. But that's all that it was. It was a push to the 25th, and then after the 25th, it's like, oh shit, this was a bad plan. What else are we going to do? By the 18th, the Bulge that was caused by the Germans' advance had turned only into a slight curve. They had basically flattened the curve of the Bulge. And this front is just moving back the other way.
Just getting less and less concave.
Yeah.
Like it was just like someone pushed and started pushing that middle back out.
And again, we're talking an area that you said was 50 by 70 miles.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a pretty big front to be moving back from the 16th to the 18th.
And it's also like the most inhospitable like area that you want to be moving in and out of, because what do you think happened to all those little roads that all those bombers now picked up on behind the Germans where they have to get out of there? That's probably half the reason they had to leave all their vehicles and armor, is because all you got to do is be like, why don't we just take out all the roads and then they're just trapped in this area?
You probably have a better chance escaping through the forest than on the roads.
Yeah, but you're then having to go through valleys and climb up over hills and everything.
Yeah, that's very true.
On the 16th, the U.S. 1st and 3rd Armies, and again, we're kind of naming these off and everything, but we're basically just saying parts of the American forces link back up with the British for the first time since the beginning of the battle. I think the British were located primarily like up on kind of the northern side of it, and it was like British, American, 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 and then down south was like Patton.
I think the French Canadians were up there with Britain, too.
I think because they had probably worked together more, that they kind of kept them together. Command structure was probably similar. And so that was the first time that they had linked back up since the beginning of the battle. And it just got to the point where as the strength of the Allied forces were moving in and they were moving in, it was basically one side getting stronger and one side just getting weaker and just getting pushed back. By the 18th, the Bulge was, like Adam said, just kind of a little bit of a concave at this point. The 22nd, one of the Panzer units, so a combination of both tanks and troops, basically leaves the Ardennes, and the U.S. troops, as soon as they see them leaving, they're chasing them out and they're moving to recapture those areas. They captured a couple towns. One of them was, I think, St. Vith, right?
St. Vith was key to the offensive because they were able to be one of the towns that needed to be taken that held out long enough to kind of slow the advance.
That's right. They got hit on the 16th, and they didn't leave the town until the 21st, and they just evacuated back to like a little bit back further to like a defensible position, held out for another 2 days till the 23rd, and that town was one of the ones that had been slated to be taken by the 17th. So they held out all the way till the 23rd to throw them off and just waste all of their resources.
Recapturing that's a big one.
Yeah.
That's got to feel real good to recapture one of the initial towns that was bombed out and attacked on the 15th or the 16th. January 25th, the Germans are pushed back completely out of the region, and the front line basically returned to what it looked like pre-offensive.
Pre-battle Bulge.
Even though the offensive failed, it did inflict some very heavy losses to the West. It set back the Allied invasion of Germany for weeks. This was something that I kind of pitched to you last night as I was doing the boards. Do you think had this offensive not happened, because, we're talking if it pushed them back for a matter of weeks, does that potentially allow the Allied forces to take Berlin before Russia gets there? How long did Russia get to Berlin before the U.S. or before the Allies did?
So
the other Allies.
So when this thing kicked off, I don't know if it was FDR or if it was Eisenhower, whoever was the direct line. I'm guessing probably FDR to Stalin. FDR told Stalin this was happening, and if there was anything that they could do to try to relieve some pressure.
It was Churchill. Yeah.
And he was like, if there's anything you can do to relieve the pressure, he's like, do it. He's like, funnily enough, we have an operation planned, a huge offensive operation planned for January 20th. 18th. We're going to go ahead and push that up to the 12th.
Yep.
And basically, the Russians launched this insane offensive and just start sweeping again into German territory on the 12th. And the combination, they're not going to lose the Battle of the Bulge and the Ardennes Offensive because that's happening. It's happening thousands and thousands of miles away. But at that, with that happening as well, that completely prevents any idea of reinforcements being sent to the Ardennes.
Yeah. Also, this was kind of a happy accident for Stalin because within those 6 days between the 12th to the 18th, there had been a thaw that had occurred. Mm-hmm. And had they waited till the 18th, they would have been bogged down in mud.
That's true.
So it even worked out well for them. And at this point, it's just they're throwing haymakers from all directions. As Chris pointed out earlier, the shortage of soldiers during this offensive was one of the first times that we see an integration in the service. And you start to see the squeeze and you start to think, well, Hitler got blown out in Russia. Hitler's last major offensive, which I'm sure he had no thought that this was going to be his last major offensive.
Yeah, I think it was the last major offensive in the West, they said.
Okay.
I think he tried to launch something in the East one more time.
Well, and it couldn't have been that major.
No.
They just didn't have that many people left.
No.
But instead of trying to look within and be like, well, these last two bad things have been of my choosing, he just blames his generals. He blames everybody else around him. It's everybody else's fault that this plan that he came up with
He's
failed.
methed out of his fucking mind.
Yeah.
Well, and here's the thing, too, kind of going back to answer your question. I still don't think, had this not happened, that the Allies would have reached Berlin. I think maybe they could have, but at the same time, I don't think that was ever their plan. I think their plan essentially, and they were completely okay with it, was to let the Russians get to Berlin. I want to say that they may have been closer, but at the same time, if your job at that point then is, you know, that the war is, you know, looking like it's on the downhill slide, you know Germany's going to lose, but you know it's just a matter of time, you're still going to be taking losses that entire time. And if you can sit back and be like, we'll go forward slowly, but we'll do it more strategically, we'll do it to mitigate our losses. The Russians are just charging fucking whole hog with kind of disregard for any of that stuff. To the other side, you know, to Great Britain and the United States and France and Canada and everyone, they're just like, let them take the losses. Let them take Berlin, because people are going to die trying to take Berlin. We're going to die trying to move all the way into Germany. Let's just keep putting pressure to where we keep draining their resources on this side, and they have to keep guys here to, you know, watch us. And let's just kind of let them do their thing. Let's save our guys and let them take the brunt of it.
I also think it could be philosophy too, because the Western powers wanted to liberate Germany. Stalin wanted Hitler.
Yeah, and that could be it too. And here's the thing.
The Red Army was not a liberating force.
No, but here, and the other thing too is they wanted to liberate Germany, but it wasn't like they didn't have some type of accord where it was like, hey, first one to Berlin gets Germany. It was always probably in the works when they were discussing what would happen post-war to Germany. There had to have been some idea in the mix and some agreement that like, hey, we'll take over co-management of this shit. So the Western allies still knew that they were going to be in there at some point. They just were in the position, especially maybe after this as well, seeing that, you know, the U.S. suffered 81,000, between 80 and 81,000 casualties, 19,000 killed. After that happens, that also probably has to sober you up a little bit to be like, let's maybe chill for a second. Let's regain our strength and let's be more methodical about this. We ended up repelling this, you know, haymaker that they went in and threw at us. Let's be thankful we did that, and let's maybe take things a little slower at this point. And at that time, you know that the Russians are advancing too, so you can kind of be like, okay, they've got it covered on that end.
They're cleaning up the East completely.
And I mean, the amount of, before we get to the losses, I want to talk about this group.
Okay.
That we've been saving for the end before we talk about the numbers, because this is fucking cool.
Yeah, this was just a wild story. I'm a little dubious as far as their leader, this guy named Lyle Book. Everything that I heard said that he was 20. When I was doing some research on him, it said that he was in the Pacific Theater in 1942.
He could have been there, yeah. So people got moved. This sounds weird. Before the 101st got moved into Bastogne, they were being pulled to sent back to the States to then be sent to the Pacific.
Maybe that's not the part, and maybe I'm just conflating this because he was the leader of this regiment, but 18 years old, he was just boots on the ground soldier, right? So I guess in 2 years he could have risen to the rank to...
Here's the thing too, is he's 18. He goes to officer school. They pulled the first people out of officer school. He's the officer. And this is only this group. This is an 18-man intelligent reconnaissance platoon. That's not to say he's in this high-ranking position.
Yeah, and I guess
he's a platoon leader.
Well, and they're not going into battle either. They're just reconnaissance.
Yes, but you have to have, you have to have that anticipation that it might lead to that. But at the same time, I can see even that age being a platoon leader if you went to some type of like previous school that made you an officer automatically coming in. But these guys, 18 men from the 99th, and 4 forward air controllers. Forward air controller is kind of like we talked about in the Navajo Codebreaker or Code Talkers episode. Forward air controller is someone that's essentially sitting in a forward position close to the line and calling in positions where the airstrikes are going to be coming in. Positions where, you want your bombers to come in or your fighters to come in and strafe. And so 18 of these intel and recon guys and 4 of these forward air controllers hold up 500 German paratroopers.
Led by a 20-year-old.
Yeah. For the full day until sunset on the 16th, putting them 16 hours behind schedule. Now, out of these guys, completely outnumbered, 5-1. They inflicted an 18-1 ratio of loss on the Germans during this.
92 casualties on the German side.
Just
German paratroopers, too.
Yeah, that was an operation that, like you're saying, there's these little operations within them. One of them was to drop 300, I think, Fallschirmjäger, that was the name for their paratroopers, kind of behind the lines to, again, kind of cause chaos and everything.
God damn it, you're brilliant.
They said they dropped like 30 of them, made their targets, and then they realized...
Oh, yeah, the guys that got sucked into the propellers.
Were there guys that got...
I don't know if this was the same one, but they talked about they were dropping paratroopers behind enemy lines, and they were dropping them at 56 miles an hour wind speed, and you were only supposed to drop them at like 25 miles an hour wind speed. So they said as people were jumping out of the planes, they were just being sucked into the propellers behind them and the other ones. They said they dropped like 300, something like that, and like 30 of them landed safely.
I don't specifically know what the Germans used for their planes, but if it was anything like the Allies, the place where they jumped was actually back behind the propellers. But I could also see if you're jumping at that speed, not having time enough to drop and fucking clipping your head or something on the fucking tail of the plane.
Well, and if there's 3 other planes behind you.
That's also true if they're flying close enough or flying lower and everything, and you're just shooting back toward them.
Yeah.
I could see somebody maybe falling into that unfortunate position. But yeah, like 30 of these guys made it to like their target area. They found out there were only 30 of them. They're like, we got to get the fuck out of here. So they spent the entire time like trying to get back to like the German line. Some of them got captured. But yeah, it just goes to show you kind of the comedy of fucking errors that took place during this.
Well, even to finish out their story, 15 of the remaining soldiers were taken prisoner. Most of them survived the POW camps.
15 of the 22.
Yes.
Okay.
And after surviving the POW camps, the IR platoon became the most decorated American unit of World War II.
Just because of each individual man receiving certain things and like probably Purple Hearts and all that stuff.
Yeah, well, and when they talked to Book about it, he said that he didn't even realize the magnitude of what they did holding them up for as long as they did until the war was over. So nobody explained to him that them holding out halted the advance enough to slow the process down to get reinforcements behind them.
Yeah.
It's absolutely incredible.
But getting back to the numbers, so yeah, 81,000 American casualties, 19,000 killed. German casualties were between 63 and 75,000. Not sure of the number killed.
What's the definition for missing?
So missing is where, so with the casualty, you're wounded, you're unable to fight. It takes you out of the ability to fight. Missing is they cannot find you. So I think what that goes is if they can't find you and they can't identify you, there's some type of thing within the military that you're MIA. You're not KIA if you can't be confirmed as dead.
Yeah.
You're missing in action. And so that's what I think they mean. And it makes sense because a lot of artillery, snow, all this kind of stuff, people are getting buried, people are getting blown apart. There's people that you're just not going to be able to find, or people that you're probably not going to be able to identify due to the damage to their body, which fucking disgusting enough to say. Yeah.
Well, they said that there were 23,000 missing from the U.S.
Yeah. U.S. lost 800 tanks to the Germans, 540, 1,000 aircraft on the U.S. Allied side, 800 on the German side. And again, if you're just going by the numbers on this, aside from like the casualties, even with the casualties, you're like, well, the fucking Germans came out on top. They lost less men, they lost less equipment, everything. That's the thing, is we were just pumping so much of that sweet, sweet American war material into Europe that it didn't matter. we were replacing shit as soon as it was blown up. It was like a Sherman would pull forward and get blown up, and then all of a sudden another Sherman would come out from behind, and they're like, "What the fuck?" But this is actually the bloodiest battle of World War II for the United States.
And let's not sell our British friends down the river. They had 1,400 casualties and 200 killed in action.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
comparing the two is a little off, but they still
they
threw their hat in the ring.
But this is known essentially as like the shining moment for the United States of World War II, and it's definitely obvious why.
But just to think about the material loss for the Germans, like you said, for the U.S., for the Allies, it didn't really matter because we were producing enough of it. But
that stuff was already on boats,
yeah,
on its way over to replace the stuff that was lost.
If you lose 800 aircrafts, you might be able to replace them, but the amount of time it takes them to replace them and then to put people in the position to fly them is insurmountable. You don't have any time with the advancement. We're talking about, so they ended up launching an entire Western Front attack in February. April is when everything goes down. So you have 2 months before Berlin is captured.
I thought 5.
Wasn't it? Didn't Hitler off himself April 18th?
Well, yeah, and we were, February. You're all the way up to February. I thought you were talking about December.
Yeah,
April would have been 5.
No, so February, when everything's over and this Western Front launches, you already have the East coming in. So you basically have 2 more months of runtime before it's all over.
And I think that's also why you're probably taking it slow, is you're just like, and you have communication with the Russians and you know how far they're advancing. And it's like, fuck, we probably could advance as fast as them, but we're going to be taking the same casualties as them. So no thanks.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Hitler's folly. I mean, the entire war was fucking Hitler's folly. But out of all the fucking crazy, just fucking throwing darts in the dark plans, to expect this thing to end in any way other than how it ended. Yeah, I don't know. I can't wrap my head around that.
It was never going to be successful. And not to give Hitler credit for anything, but to give him credit for sticking to his guns to the bitter end, which...
You're saying that in hindsight because it only worked out to our benefit. So, like, that's like saying, thank you, Hitler, for being such a moron.
Yeah.
It's basically what it equates
it is.
to. The entire war is that it, like, a thank you card to Hitler for fucking starting the war in the East. Like, the entire war is just full of these thank you card moments for him.
Yeah, the guy just kept tripping over his own feet. Mm-hmm. And this was the last big trip that he took, and it blows me away.
Last thing before we go, guys, if you guys have any family members that were part of the, Battle of the Bulge or anything like that, we'd love you to send us their stories. We'd love to hear about that kind of stuff. So yeah, do that if you can. You got anything else, buddy?
Nope.
All right, guys, thanks for joining us another week. We'll catch you next time.
Peace.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit them with it.
Our Instagram is historically high pod, historically high pod, and we are on Twitter at historically high. That's historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.